Chapter 356. Roar. The divine host screamed incessantly. Its dark red blood splashed out. It hadn't expected Yi Shiwen to be so tyrannical. Such tyranny would have been normal if Yi Shiwen were at half-step sage realm. However, he was a mere human expert, and that too at a much lower realm. Yet the divine Ho had been pushed to such an extent. It simply couldn't believe this. The divine Ho firmly believed that its body was extremely strong. An average person couldn't injure it. So much so that it could ignore the attacks of an ordinary legendary 9th stage expert. In fact, the attacks of such a person wouldn't even break its scales. However, Yi Shiwen had done it. His one palm attack had severely injured it. Yi Shiwen was far more tyrannical than its imagination. This reminded it of those records on the people who had inherited the bloodlines of the ancient human race. The human ancestors used to be extremely powerful in the ancient times, same as the other races. The first generations of the ancient human race had differential abilities, or one could say that they had great magical powers. These so-called people with special physique had somehow inherited the genes of their ancestors. Yi Ziwen's performance was extremely tyrannical, like that of the human race's ancestors. I'm a mythological beast. I can neither die nor be extinguished. You are a petty human. Yet you dare to contend me. Do you have a death wish? The heaven-facing Ho roared. Suddenly, the flames erupted from its body frantically. They then advanced towards Yi Shiwen like a giant fireball. These flames appeared silver-white in color. They had been produced by the burning of the blood essence within its body. This was its very own spirit fire and was extremely terrifying. Wherever they went, the space got burnt and collapsed into innumerable pieces. The silvery white flames charged towards Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen shot his sword intention, and it collided with those flames. But the sword intention was burned as soon as it came in contact with those flames. Yi Ziwen's complexion changed since his sword intention couldn't defeat the flames. What? Yi Shiwen was completely stunned. Yi Shiwen, be careful. These flames were produced by the burning of the blood essence in its body. They are entirely different from ordinary flames. Yi Mo shouted. A chill ran through Yi Ziwen's body. Blood essence was extremely valuable for living creatures. Assuming Yi Shiwen were to sustain injuries and a lot of blood were to gush out of his body, the injuries could be repaired in time. However, the lost blood essence couldn't be restored. The blood essence was the most important part of one's body. Even the top experts didn't have much blood essence. To burn one's blood essence was equivalent to going all out. One's strength would decrease enormously once too much blood essence is lost. Therefore, this method was only used in a desperate situation. That mass of flames rumbled in front of Yi Shiwen. It broke through his defense and approached him for the kill. A huge beast's claw emerged from inside these flames. It ferociously shot towards Yi Shiwen at a lightning speed. A cruel smile appeared on the house face as these silver flames surged up in the air. Yi Shiwen was already dead in its opinion. That terrifying front claw wrapped in the sliver flames blasted towards Yi Shiwen. It seemed as if it would burn him to death. Humph! Yi Shiwen snorted and those flames boomed over. Yi Ziwen's hand glittered golden, and the golden divinities covered his entire arm. It then penetrated into those flames, and those flames were unable to burn through the layer of divinities. Yi Ziwen's palm attack and the beast's claws maliciously collided. Bang! Both sides' terrifying powers began to sweep across. The divine house flesh was extremely tyrannical. However, Yi Ziwen's tyrant body was even more so. Its front claws had been broken by that palm attack. The divine host screamed yet again. Those flames had been extinguished since it couldn't continue to burn them. The scales on its body had also lost their luster. It realized that it wasn't fit enough to be Yi Ziwen's opponent. Yi Shiwen was far more powerful than it had imagined. How is this possible? How can you be more formidable than me? It hadn't paid particular attention earlier. Hence, it had lost to the magical powers of the ancient human race. However, Yi Shiwen had pushed it into a very disadvantageous position by now. It became frightened as well as angry. It was in a state of shock. It wasn't born long ago. However, it had seen many elite disciples of the true martial university, and they had been nothing in front of it. In fact, they hadn't been able to withstand a single blow from it. This had made its pride soar even higher inside its heart. However, Yi Shiwen had shattered its pride and confidence. Yi Ziwen's strength was too astonishing. Stupid! Yi Shiwen sneered. His sword intention condensed into a long sword. He then rushed towards that divine Ho. The divine Ho had suffered heavy losses because of Yi Shiwen. It now had lesser capability to resist his attacks. A trace of fear slowly started to emerge in its eyes. Whoosh! The divine Ho suddenly turned around. It turned into a streamer of light and flew away into the distance. But how could Yi Shiwen allow it to succeed? He opened his devil wings and started to chase it. However, the divine Ho was determined to escape and was unceasingly burning its blood essence. He didn't care if its strength would see a substantial decrease because of this. What would be the point of so much strength if it were to get killed? How would it not understand this basic logic? Yi Ziwen's speed was much faster than that of divine Ho in the beginning. However, it then started to burn its blood essence and left him far behind within a short period of time. However, Yi Shiwen didn't lose track and continued to chase it. He tracked unceasingly it with his eyes. He was in no hurry. His opponent had used its trump card by burning its blood essence. This meant that it had run out of tricks. Therefore, he was content in keeping an eye on it. He knew that it would have to stop sooner or later. It was impossible for the divine Ho to continue with running like this for long. Yi Shiwen would wait until the divine house blood essence was completely depleted. Then he could kill it. In fact, he wouldn't have to put any effort in killing it. Yi Shiwen had entered an extreme desolate land while he chased the divine Ho. Groups of star beasts could be seen everywhere as they had traversed through the region. However, they had gradually vanished as his chase had taken him deeper into this underground world. The scenery around him had turned desolate and silent. Soon, the divine house speed began to get slower and slower. Yi Shiwen was about to kill the divine Ho. However, he suddenly saw the figure of a person rushing over from a distant place. He looked closely and realized that it was Luo Yihang. He saw that Luo Yihang was tightly pulling a sword code with his hand. This was the same sword code that had appeared earlier, the buried sword secrets. Luo Yihang had arrived here while chasing the sword code. No wonder he didn't have the time to investigate the cause of that law enforcement disciple's death. Luo Yihang and Yi Shiwen had discovered each other at the same time. Luo Yihang's killing intention locked onto Yi Shiwen. This ice-cold killing intention could scare anyone and would leave them to tremble in fear. Luo Yihang put away the buried sword secrets that he had obtained. He coldly stared at Yi Shiwen. His imposing aura swept out like that of an astonishing blade energy. If one would look from afar with their eyes slightly closed, perhaps they would think Luo Yihang to be a blade, not a person. His long blade had formidable power and could cut off any other long blade. This was the power of a man's unification with his blade. Humph! I was wondering how to find you, but you found me on your own accord. Let's continue the fight that we had left unfinished. Luo Yihang challenged. Luo Yihang caught a glimpse of the divine Ho that was flying in front of Yi Shiwen. Suddenly, a trace of greed appeared in his eyes. He had arrived here for two reasons: the sword code and the divine Ho. The sword code had already fallen into his hands. But he needed to get the divine Ho in order to exit this underground world. More importantly, he wanted to grab this divine Ho since he wished to make it his mount. No one knew this divine house origin. However, it was Buddha's mount according to folklore. Buddhism wasn't prevalent in the true martial world. However, that didn't mean that nobody knew about Buddha. Buddha possessed great magical powers according to the fables. He enjoyed the reputation of having a mysterious inheritance in all 10,000 worlds. He was famous for having outstanding fighting prowess. He was considered the epitome of magical powers. Luo Yihang had great ambitions in his heart. He wanted to become like Buddha. He wanted to become a peerless powerhouse who could suppress the universe. But the first step was to capture and subdue this divine Ho. Clang! The blade energy in Luo Yihang's hand condensed into a long blade. It was then released in the sky. It turned into a blade cage and fell down with a bang. The divine Ho tried to intercept it, but was surrounded by walls made of blades. It would have been difficult for it to evade this attack even in its peak condition. But it was severely injured, and not strength was left in it to save itself from this predicament. It could only escape when Luo Yihang would die. Otherwise, it couldn't. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's blood and energy surged within his body and stirred up to the max. The energy rushed out of his body and went into the sky. It seemed like a pillar that was supporting the heaven. Then it burst and set off golden waves. Yi Shiwen got on top of the golden waves. It seemed as if he was riding them. The killing intention swept across the surroundings. Luo Yihang had forced Yi Shiwen into a hopeless situation the last time. This had made Yi Shiwen extremely angry. He had secretly sworn that he would severely beat up Luo Yihang if he were to get an opportunity. However, he had never thought that he would get the opportunity so soon. Yi Shiwen, I will strangle you to death, but I'll leave your entire corpse intact. Luo Yihang said coldly. He wasn't just overbearing. He was strong as well. But he wasn't paying any attention to Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen was strong, but he wasn't his opponent yet. He would have killed Yi Shiwen if hadn't been afraid of the sword sage gaining advantage by entering the pit first. The sword code was in his hands at present. The divine Ho was also in his hands. And Yi Shiwen had also been brought in front of him. He felt like the heavens were on his side. You think you can kill me? Yi Shiwen sneered, I have tolerated you for a long time now. You're nothing but a pig with a long onion root inserted in its nose who pretends to be an elephant. You're courting death. Luo Yihang said coldly. He released formidable blade energy, and it condensed into a massive long blade. It rushed towards Yi Shiwen like a flash of lightning. It shattered the space along its path. Yi Zaiwen's fighting intention boiled. His killing intention surged up. He condensed a sword intention in his hand and shot it across the sky. It forged ahead to face the incoming attack. There was huge difference between their strengths the time they met. Hence, Yi Shiwen had been forced into a disadvantageous position back then. That one was certainly a very desperate fight on Yi Zaiwen's part. However, Yi Shiwen was unbridled this time. He moved forward to face the enemy without any difficulty. Chapter 357. Bang! The aftermath of their battle shattered the surrounding space. The pitch-black chaos was extremely frightening. Luo Yihang sensed that he couldn't overpower Yi Shiwen. The situation of this battle was different from the previous one. The previous battle had been near one-sided. Yi Shiwen had struggled to keep up in the last battle. In fact, he had been forced into a thoroughly disadvantageous position. Perhaps Yi Shiwen would have died back then if he didn't have such a strange healing technique. However, Yi Zaiwen's strength had enhanced since then. This surprised Luo Yihang. But this excited him as well. He was somewhat lonely at the top. It was difficult for him to find a worthy opponent, someone with strength such as his own. An ordinary expert of legendary 9th stage certainly wasn't fit to be his opponent. However, he seemed to have found a powerful opponent. This caused his killing intention to boil up. His ruthless aura began to overflow in the surroundings. He felt a sense of pleasure in torturing his opponents to death. He felt as if he was about to step on an ant prior to killing Yi Shiwen. Haha, I didn't expect that you would have had progressed so much since then. I like to torture geniuses to death. Just looking at you is making me excited. I'll let you die with dignity. Luo Yihang laughed out loud. A somewhat cruel expression appeared on his face. Enough talking. Prepare yourself to be sent on your way to the other world. Yi Shiwen sneered. He didn't argue with Luo Yihang and forged ahead step by step. His imposing aura exploded loudly. His sword intention went across the vast sky, and a golden luster illuminated half of the vicinity. Luo Yihang wasn't ordinary either. His ominous power was dreadful. His imposing aura boiled up. It seemed as if it could sweep away the entire world as it advanced towards Yi Shiwen. Bang! The earth trembled as the blade energy and the sword intention collided and scattered. The space disintegrated and a terrifying energy storm was set off. This was the most terrifying battle. Both parties were extremely fast. It was beyond the extent of the capabilities of one's naked eyes. They had exchanged over 100, or even over 1,000, blows within a split second. Both parties used their entire strength. They didn't give any fancy chances to the other. It resembled the collision between two absolute powers. Luo Yihang was formidable. He was at much higher level than Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Ziwen's tyrant body was even more tyrannical. Neither man seemed willing to let go of his hold on this decisive battle. Bang! 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 They had spared no effort and had given their best in this fight. The world itself had been shattered and reconstructed, and it seemed as if a new world had taken birth. In fact, it was being shattered and reborn with every successive blow they exchanged, and again. Whoosh! An extremely loud sound reverberated and blood splashed out. Yi Ziwen's sword intention had opened a horrible wound in Luo Yihang's body. The sight of this wound could leave people trembling in fear. Luo Yihang had nearly gotten killed. In fact, he could have been cleft into two. Luo Yihang was panting heavily. He had nearly lost his life to Yi Shiwen a moment ago. He hadn't expected this to happen. Perhaps he didn't think that Yi Shiwen could have the strength to injure him. He had never thought that he would be forced into such a distressful situation one day. His strength was considered relatively superior to others, even among the experts of same level. Luo Yihang was at the peak of half-step legendary 9th stage, and a very few experts of the same level could stand up to him. Hence, he hadn't considered that he could lose to Yi Shiwen. Luo Yihang's eyes turned even colder. He then shouted, "Die!" Then, Luo Yihang raised his long blade and rushed forward. He arrived in front of Yi Shiwen in a flash. His long blade had streaked across the sky and had shattering the space along its path into small pieces. It was an extremely terrifying scene. Yi Shiwen had occupied the winning position. Hence, he was calm. His sword intention transformed into a long sword. The killing intention flickered at the tip of the sword as the sword light darted outwards. Both parties had displayed terrifying fighting strength. In fact, it had exceeded far above their respective levels. Luo Yihang's long blade had evolved into the image of a god spirit. It seemed as if it was talking a stroll on earth. It felt as if it had then gotten angry and had cracked open the heaven upon witnessing the hardships that exist in the mortal world. It seemed aloof from worldly affairs. It didn't appear to have originated from the heavenly principle. The powerful blade beam had suppressed the surrounding space. Yi Ziwen's sword light darted outwards. His sword intention started to produce a buzzing sound. It seemed to have been stimulated by the sudden evolution in Luo Yihang's blade technique. It congealed into an illusory shadow in the sky. It was the ghostly figure of that old sword expert whom Yi Shiwen had seen some time back. An intense and imposing aura swept across. It seemed as if it could puncture the world. A pure sword intention wantonly emerged out from the shadow of that old sword expert. He was the sword was him. The blade beam and sword intention collided again. That blade god and the old sword expert maliciously collided into each other. This wasn't a collision between two moves. It was a collision of two wills. This was a collision of two entirely different styles of comprehensions. That blade skill of that god carrying a blade in its hand was tyrannical enough to dominate the world. However, it was hard to tell what sort of hidden skills that old sword expert possessed, since a single sword attack of his was capable of breaking out 10,000 principles. This was a collision of two entirely different martial ways. And it was extremely terrifying. Even the chaos had started to boil. In fact, it seemed as if the entire universe was about to enter the cycle of reincarnation. Yi Shiwen hadn't anticipated that a god spirit could be resurrected inside his sword intention. However, he couldn't do much about it at this time. He didn't think too much about it, and rushed forth to confront the enemy. Bang! Both bodies were sent flying in opposite directions post the collision. Luo Yihang's body had been stabbed by Yi Shiwen. A huge hole had been opened in it. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't in a good condition either. Luo Yihang's blade energy had cut open a huge wound on his body, and blood had started to drip from it. This Luo Yihang wasn't ordinary. A very few people could reach legendary 9th stage. Both parties were powerful enough to display the invincible strength of legendary 9th stage. Therefore, both parties had been fighting head-on and had given a tough fight to each other. However, Yi Shiwen was fearless, and the look in his eyes had turned even more profound. It could be seen that his wounds were getting restored very quickly. His attacks were even faster than battered Luo Yihang's. In fact, Luo Yihang had already suffered 2 consecutive losses. This was the advantage in Yi Ziwen's favor. It was also one of his hidden trump cards. Suddenly, Yi Ziwen's hand formed a Han seal. A huge mountain seal pressed down like a gigantic dragon and smashed on Luo Yihang's back. The man wasn't able to avoid the attack since his fighting strength wasn't at its peak condition after having suffered 2 consecutive losses at Yi Shiwen hands. And now that Han seal had suddenly dropped from above, he couldn't respond quickly enough and got hit. Bang! He was smashed to the ground by the Han seal. A large crater was made in the ground. Ah! Luo Yihang roared loudly. He struggled to break free from Yi Ziwen's Han seal. His terrifying power slashed the nearby land. He was in a difficult situation. His hair was disheveled and his eyes were red. He was stubbornly staring at Yi Shiwen. His terrifying killing intention was locked on Yi Shiwen. He was young and was proud of himself. He had been treated as a top-notch cultivation genius his entire life. He had never suffered such a loss. He had considered Yi Shiwen merely an ant the previous time they had fought. However, he had regarded Yi Shiwen as a worthy opponent this time. But he hated Yi Shiwen to the extreme now. His expression turned violent since he had suffered this kind of loss. Most people wouldn't be able to look straight at his hideous face. His long blade set off a burst of blade shadows in the entire sky. Each of these blade shadows could cut through the mountains and rivers. They flew right across the sky and rushed towards Yi Shiwen. It seemed that 10 million blade shadows had condensed in the sky. And they then arrived in front of Yi Shiwen like poisonous snakes. The entire sky had been torn into 100,000 rifts. And each rift extended up to several hundred meters. It was an extremely terrifying scene. Yi Shiwen sneered. Another Han seal descended. It rushed toward the incoming blade shadows and destroyed them. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't done yet. He brandished his sword and the sword intention shattered the space into countless pieces as it rushed forward to face those incoming blade beams. Bang! Yi Ziwen's sword intention destroyed those blade beams. Then he rushed over and stretched out his hands. He then displayed the hidden dragon rising from the abyss move. His hands turned into a pair of dragon's claws. They brimmed with golden light as they tore the space. Bang! The astonishing crack opened the entire space. It extended up to far distances and seemed to have destroyed all obstacles in its path. Nothing could withstand this attack. But this attack hadn't been directed at the enemy's main body. Rather, it had torn the space open and broken it into small pieces. This had made it impossible for the enemy to stand. This attack soon arrived in front of Luo Yihang, but he wasn't able to evade the attack. He stretched out his hands to block it. However, he was unable to resist the terrifying energy of the attack. His hands started to get boiled up. Luo Yihang retreated promptly. However, he couldn't do it quickly enough since he was wounded. His right arm was struck by the attack and was ripped apart. Blood started to gush out from the wound. His face was covered in fine beads of sweat. He was feeling severe pain and had been left to pant. However, he secretly felt glad in his heart. That attack was extremely terrifying. Perhaps it could have torn him into 2 halves if he hadn't avoided it in time, just like it had torn the space. Yi Shiwen looked coldly towards Luo Yihang and said, "Today is your last day." Yi Shiwen admitted that Luo Yihang was very strong. However, it was pointless since he was about to die. The more formidable an enemy is, the lesser chance one should give them to make an escape. Otherwise, the enemy would surely cause a big trouble in the future since they were allowed to grow up. Don't even think about it. Luo Yihang's body released a burst of unimaginable blade energy. It was accompanied by a broken fragment of his blade, and it rushed towards Yi Shiwen. It was an extremely horrifying attack and was beyond one's imagination. The blade fragment contained the power to destroy heaven and earth. There was a possibility that Yi Shiwen could have been caught off guard if he had used this attack in the beginning. In fact, he could have gotten injured very severely. However, Luo Yihang's body had sustained very serious injuries by now. His strength had declined frantically. His attacks didn't pose a big threat to Yi Shiwen any longer. Yi Shiwen effortlessly avoided the attack. Humph! Yi Shiwen snorted and struck Luo Yihang's body with his palm. The palm attack killed Luo Yihang. Yi Shiwen had learned the sword intention attack by mimicking the original sword intention attack displayed by this old sword expert. Chapter 358. Yi Shiwen found large quantities of Spirit Dawn and Spirit Stones on Luo Yihang's corpse. He also found various kinds of treasures. Luo Yihang had risen to fame abruptly in these recent 2 years, and Yi Shiwen could tell that he must had an excellent family background. There were various kinds of medicinal herbs. Some were even over 1,000 years old. In fact, many of them were over 5,000 years. They also contained a premium herb that was over 10,000 years old. These herbs were planted in a portable farm inside his storage space. These herbs obviously belonged to Yi Shiwen now. These treasures weren't worth less than 30 million Spirit Dawn. Yi Shiwen once had far more Spirit Dawn than this. However, that was in the past. The mysterious space in his mind had consumed large amounts of these Spirit Dawn to produce spirit energy. However, there rarely came a time when he wasn't running low on spirit energy nowadays. He had basically been running low on spirit energy all year round. However, the Spirit Stones and Spirit Dawn found on Luo Yihang's body added up to millions. It was the same as obtaining an extreme wealth. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had less than 1 million Spirit Dawn left. This was like a timely rain for him. However, the biggest gain was that sword code. It was called the Buried Sword Secrets. The origin of Buried Sword Secrets was quite profound. However, the entire swordplay only had 4 tricks in reality: Buried Person Sword, Buried Earth Sword, Buried Heaven Sword, and Great Nirvana Sword. Yi Shiwen observed it carefully, but he couldn't tell which expert had left it behind. One could discern that it was an extremely terrifying technique from the names itself, especially the last move named Great Nirvana Sword. According to the description on it, their universal chaos would take birth within the range of area enshrouded by Great Nirvana Sword. This would restart the cycle of reincarnation. Everything that would then enter the reincarnation cycle would fade away and cease to exist, including the user of this technique. This move belonged to the category of suicide attacks. However, Yi Shiwen didn't dare to look down on this Buried Sword Secrets. Yi Shiwen had majored in blade technique cultivation. However, he possessed the mysterious space. Therefore, cultivating this sword technique wasn't a problem for him. Anything could be solved as long as he had sufficient spirit energy. But the biggest profit was that half-blade point. It was uncertain where Luo Yihang had obtained it from. It was merely a small fragment of a blade, but it could emit chilling rays of light. According to Yi Mo, it could possibly be an immortal tool. However, that might not necessarily be true. This small fragment of light-emitting blade point was a priceless material. It was beyond anyone's imagination. Roar! The divine Ho roared angrily from afar. The blade cage had disappeared along with Luo Yihang's death. The divine Ho had been waiting for this. It tried to escape. But how could Yi Shiwen allow his target escape that easily? He immediately pursued it. Yi Shiwen finally overtook the divine Ho after chasing it for a quarter of an hour. He sneered and slapped it. It went flying to the roadside. The divine Ho had already exhausted its blood essence by now. It didn't have the power to resist Yi Ziwen's attack. You will regret chasing me, human. The divine Ho looked coldly towards Yi Shiwen. It appeared somewhat relieved, but also harbored some resentment. Yi Ziwen's was startled in his heart. He looked around, but he could only see a completely desolate scene. He couldn't see any living creatures. A chill ran down his spine. This scene was enough to make people tremble with fear. Yi Shiwen had a bad feeling about this. He decided to kill the divine Ho first, and then proceed to dealing with other things. You don't have a choice. Yi Shiwen sneered. He was just about to kill that divine Ho with his palm attack. But suddenly, a huge crack was torn open in the sky. A big hand swept down towards Yi Shiwen to grab him. An overwhelming and heinous in nature power flooded the atmosphere as it advanced towards him. Yi Shiwen's entire body was suddenly covered in cold sweat. However, he had no way out of this situation. He was carried off by this big hand. He then fell inside the crack in space. Yi Shiwen regained his conscience after some time, and found that he had arrived in a valley. This valley wasn't very large. It was a little more than 10 square kilometers in area. However, this valley had a huge pit. Unexpectedly, dark red blood was gushing out of it. The blood flowing out of the valley had also permeated into the earth. Bang! 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 An ear-splitting sound of heartbeats reverberated inside Yi Shiwen's mind. He could hear heartbeats pounding loudly, one after another. He felt as if he had stepped on the body of a gigantic creature. Suddenly his hair stood on end. Who is this? Yi Shiwen shouted. He was secretly vigilant in his mind. It is me, an old voice reverberated. Yi Shiwen looked up. He saw an old man clad in a long robe. The robe was dazzling like the stars. This old man seemed like a warlord. His bloodlust could still be sensed. Who are you? Yi Shiwen asked. He was vigilant inside. He had a feeling that being caught and brought over to this valley might have a relation with this old man. Yi Shiwen could sense the aura of an invincible sage expert coming from that old man's body. This was entirely different from a legendary level expert like Yi Shiwen. It seemed as if a strong expert of the sage realm had arrived before him. He didn't know whether that old man would be hostile towards him or not. However, this wasn't a good thing for him. I am the star colossus that had been sealed here, that old man lightly said. Yi Shiwen was immediately frightened. He shocked to the extreme when he realized this was the place where the star colossus had been sealed. The ancestors of the true martial university had spared no effort to contend against this star colossus. Moreover, this evil star god had been the main culprit in the decline of the true martial university. He had led to the declined true martial university, and that too in its days of prosperity. How could he be some ordinary beast? It was hard to count the number of senior experts of the true martial university who had died in his hands back then. Yet, those senior experts couldn't kill it. They could only seal this peerless ominous beast. How could Yi Shiwen not be in an utter shock after he had heard this old man relate that he was that star colossus? Yi Shiwen knew that there were many magical powers that could be used to change one's appearance. However, it was very hard to believe that this old man wasn't at par with that extremely cruel star colossus. It was no fluke that Yi Shiwen had been caught by the old man, and had been entirely unable to fight back. He could feel the power of sage on that old man's body. However, he would have died innumerable times by now if he was only a sage expert. The true martial university used to have many experts of the great sage realm. Hence, a star colossus of sage realm shouldn't have been able to pose any challenge to the true martial university. The old man seemed to be aware of Yi Shiwen's doubts. He faintly smiled and said, "You've guessed it right. This is not my main body. It is only the incarnation of a wisp of my primordial soul." Yi Shiwen didn't heave a sigh of relief as one would expect. He was instead shocked further. How dreadful would his main body be if just a part of his soul had such power? This was just beyond the scope of his imagination. Yi Shiwen had suddenly started to believe those legends. This was a star colossus which had once turned the entire true martial university upside down. I don't know why Senior has brought me here. Yi Shiwen cupped his hands respectfully and said. Yi Shiwen was secretly alert. This exceptionally evil god had nearly destroyed the true martial university once. He would certainly not find him for making reprisals. This was only a wisp of its soul, but it still had the strength of sage realm. Yi Shiwen didn't have the power to fight back. Does the senior wish for me to help him in escaping from this prison? Yi Shiwen glanced at that old man and said, but Yi Shiwen wouldn't help him. In fact, he would rather die than helping him. It wasn't because Yi Shiwen wanted to take a moral high ground. There might have been some room for negotiation if it were some other person, or some great devilish being. However, this star colossus was a different case altogether. The star colossi were known to eat stars as food. If they could swallow a star, then they should be able to swallow a planet too. And their strength would advance by leaps and bounds if they were to devour a world. Therefore, the entire true martial world would be in danger if this evil god were to be released. This would be the so-called case of covering the nest to save the eggs. How would Yi Shiwen survive on his own if the entire true martial world was destroyed? He would collapse with the true martial world. That old man shook his head and said, "My main body is sealed. As per your current strength, you will be of no use even if you practice for 1,000 or 2,000 years. You're too weak." Yi Shiwen listened, but he didn't show any indignation on his face. Indeed, he was too weak. At least in comparison to this wisp of the evil god's soul that still had the power of Sage Realm. He indeed didn't have such qualifications. However, someone has arrived here after countless years. Therefore I must bet on you. You should be able to practice to the great Sage Realm in this lifetime with your strength and talent. But only if you're favored by good luck. That old man glanced at Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen clearly felt that he was being looked down upon. Yi Shiwen didn't say anything in reply. Indeed, his innate talent and root bone structure couldn't be regarded as top-notch. In fact, his ability was a far cry from those people with special physique, and even Luo Yihang. However, he hadn't been defeated yet. And that was the fact. Yi Shiwen had always believed that people could have proud and unyielding characters. However, they must not be arrogant. People with lofty and unyielding character wouldn't admit defeat throughout their lives. Such traits in character were necessary to rise to the peak of martial arts. However, one must not succumb to arrogance. Arrogance had a tendency to carry one away. One may not be able to understand the difference between right and wrong. They may not be able to acknowledge the truth. Everything they would do could then be governed by arrogance. And this arrogance would only evolve over time. Yi Shiwen had been very clear about the approach he must have. He had killed countless disciples. Many were superior to him in every way possible. They were more talented than him, and had better bone foundation. However, the sense of victory would get to his head if he would start to believe that he was better than them. And if one wasn't clear about themselves, then death wouldn't be far away. Chapter 359. However, Yi Shiwen had never been discouraged because of this. He had never relied on his inner talent and bone foundation because he knew how to foster his strengths and avoid his weaknesses. Therefore, he didn't care about this so-called weakness of his. One could have good innate talent and strong bone foundation. However, these weren't enough to solve every problem. The strength he possessed had undoubtedly originated because of his reliance on the mysterious space. However, it had depended far more on his efforts. How could he have survived if he hadn't practiced like a workaholic? And how could he possibly have achieved such strength? That old man somewhat admired Yi Shiwen when he saw that he hadn't been discouraged by his remark. That man you killed was much stronger than you. Whether it was his bone foundation or innate talent, he was superior to you. I had thought to bring him here since I honestly didn't expect that you would kill him. That was beyond my expectation. That old man said. It seemed from his tone that he hadn't been optimistic of Yi Shiwen's chances. I see, so the sword code and the divine Ho. Yi Shiwen suddenly realized that this old man had used these tricks to attract people. It was no accident that so many rare treasures and such an unrivaled secret technique had appeared so abruptly. Yi Shiwen had found it strange in the beginning as well. However, he finally understood that these things had emerged from this place. Yes, it was I who sent those treasures out. The old man nodded. This old man had swallowed countless stars in his evil god form. A few treasures didn't mean anything to him. Hence, he had used these treasures to attract several geniuses. Yi Shiwen, be careful. I can see that this old man isn't ordinary. Yi Mo's voice resounded in Yi Shiwen's mind. The concealment of the heavenly source mirror was very tight. This old man had no means to find Yi Mo's existence. This is like fishing. He used those treasures to attract several geniuses. I don't know what his purpose is, however, you must be careful. Yi Shiwen secretly nodded. He knew that he mustn't let his guard down. This was an old habit of Yi Zaiwen's. You won't be the only one he'll select. Consider it an investment. You don't have much strength at the moment. However, you can become very formidable in the span of 1,000 or 2,000 years. Then I will not have wasted my energy for nothing. That old man indifferently said. Yi Shiwen realized that this old man had used a long net to catch the big fishes. And these people would eventually become formidable experts. They could even set him free in the future. That would be enough as a return on his investment. These people would leave in some time. However, a large number of the topmost disciples would arrive later from the future trials of the new disciples of the true martial university. And the scope of choice would continue to become bigger. In fact, there would be a probability of many formidable experts gathering here in the future. One might not see the result within a short time. However, one day these people would grow and become the backbone of the true martial university. It would take a very long time though. You're the first one to arrive here. I must give you this gift even if we've been brought together by fate. That old man said. A mass of extremely strong star power appeared in his hands. It then flew inside Yi Zaiwen's body. Yi Shiwen suddenly felt as if he had bathed in a sea of stars as this mass of star power immersed inside his body. It was a very rich star power. He couldn't have absorbed this much star power even if he had killed thousands or 10,000s of star beasts of legendary 7th or 8th stage. Indeed, it's really a massive amount of star power. Even a small planet won't have this much of star power. Yi Mo gasped. This amount of star power was enough for Yi Shiwen to condense Mars. In fact, it was more than enough. However, Yi Mo's complexion suddenly changed. He said, Humph. Yi Shiwen, this is a trap. It contains a magic seed. This magic is a very malicious trick. It is mixed with the star power. The magic seed will get refined if you refine the star power. It will then get planted within your body. Then you'll become his puppet. He won't just control you, he could exploit you as well. Yi Mo said, there are many ways of doing this in the devil world. There are various complicated ways of doing it, and all methods offer different qualities. However, the essence is the same. You'll become his slave if you refine it. You won't be able to run away, and he'll even be able to peep into your secrets. Everything you have will be dominated by him. In fact, it will be useless to become more powerful than him. His one whim will be enough to kill you. Yi Shiwen secretly gasped. A chill ran down his spine. Why was this evil star colossus being so polite? Only a part of his soul had transformed into human form. But one simply couldn't treat him like a human. It was still an ominous monster. One couldn't expect a terrifying star-eating creature like him to have good thoughts. He was so kind-hearted that he had released such great amounts of treasures, and had given away such an abundant star power. He had said that these people would become formidable experts in the future, and that they might set him free as a repayment of that debt. However, their intentions couldn't be predicted. The will of a person was the most complicated thing. This star colossus had lived for countless years. Moreover, he was an old fox. How could he not have made preparations for this problem? Under no circumstances would he give away such great amounts of benefits without insurances. He was no idiot. However, this magic seed isn't some good thing to condense because it requires great amount of life essence from the user. Condensing 1 or 2 of such magic seeds can injure the user. One must do it only if it is extremely important. That is why very few people use magic seeds. Yi Mo said, it seems that he has chosen you after much consideration. Yi Shiwen was somewhat puzzled. It had seemed as if the opposite party must be in contempt with his ability. However, he had then used a risky method like the magic seed on him. What should I do now? Yi Shiwen asked secretly. Yi Shiwen and Yi Mo were using the soul search technique to communicate, very quickly at that. However, that old man arrived in front of Yi Shiwen in a split second. He then said, you must refine the star power I gave you without any delay. Otherwise, you may have a problem in walking out from here alive. Yi Shiwen was suspicious. That old man waved his big hand and a screen appeared in front of Yi Zaiwen's eyes. He could see that groups of experts were involved in a death match just outside this valley. One among them was the Sword Sage. He was leading the experts of the Sword Tomb. It was hard to tell the advantage that the Sword Sage had obtained, but he had jumped to half-step Legendary's great complete realm. His future prospects were limitless with such cultivation and strength. In fact, he would be regarded as the seed disciple of the true martial university. However, that Sword Sage had been pushed into a disadvantageous position despite stepping into half-step Legendary's great complete realm. He was running into danger one after another. He had been pushed into this disadvantageous position by that brother Fan of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. Yi Shiwen had seen the memories of the Xian Yuan disciple he had killed. Hence, he knew that this brother Fan was an illustrious genius among the disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. His name was Fan Ming. The lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall regarded him as an extremely valuable genius. He had recently joined the Xian Yuan Palace Hall under the care of the Palace Hall Lord and had gained much prominence. The lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall held a higher position than the heads of the peak in the true martial university. In fact, it was considered as one of the most influential positions inside the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. The Sword Sage had stepped into the half-step Legendary's great complete realm very recently. However, Fan Ming had reached the peak of half-step Legendary's great complete realm. In fact, he was only a half-step away from entering the semi-sage realm. However, there was a difference of heaven and earth on the either sides of this half-step. The Sword Sage was an exceptional talent, but he wouldn't be able to enter the semi-sage realm in less than 5 years. Yi Shiwen suddenly noticed that the Sword Sage was some he had known. He was clad in a black robe. His sharp sword skill was world-shaking. He had excellent strength. An average person was no match for him. However, he was matched against that Fan Ming. This disciple of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall was a terrifying existence in this session of disciples. The Sword Sage was that black-robed powerhouse Yi Shiwen had seen on the ancient road. Yi Shiwen had never seen the Sword Sage after entering the university. He had only heard about him. However, he had never thought that this Sword Sage would turn out to be that black-robed powerhouse. Yi Shiwen and the Sword Sage used to have similar strengths. However, the Sword Sage had broken through to half-step Legendary's great complete realm in a very short period of time. Yi Shiwen himself had been struggling within half-step Legendary realm. Therefore, he knew that the promotion of every stage within half-step Legendary realm was no joke. Even Jian Wuchen had only reached half-step Legendary 8th stage after obtaining an inheritance. But what kind of an outstanding backing did this Sword Sage have? Yi Shiwen saw Jian Wuchen and Mu Ling in the Sword Tomb's team. The Wolf Cub was also there. These three people had a very tacit understanding. However, the entire battle formation of the Sword Tomb was under a firm attack from the experts of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. In fact, it could collapse at any time. Only a few dozens of experts of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall remained. They were nothing in comparison to the number the true martial university had. However, the situation was very different since they were only faced with the disciples of the Sword Tomb. The number of disciples in the Sword Tomb's party was a bit higher than the ones in the Xian Yuan Palace Halls. In fact, the disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall were far behind in terms of quality as well. However, the Sword Sage was being suppressed by Fan Ming. Therefore, the entire team of the Sword Tomb was being suppressed. However, Yi Shiwen didn't get much time to think about it because that old man put away that screen and said, "I've seen everything you've done since you arrived here. I know that you'll not survive against those disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. They wish to eradicate all disciples of your true martial university. That's why they've killed those people. You'll die if he arrives here. You must not expect me to protect you because these disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall are also amongst these ones I've selected as potential candidates. I know that you're practicing a power technique that requires star power. You may obtain the strength to fight back if you absorb this star power." That old man's sharp eyes started to compel Yi Shiwen. Notes: Half-step Legendary 9th Stage Seed Disciple, a special category of disciples who receive special benefits and resources from the sect. They are nourished and cultivated just like a plant seed. Chapter 360. The old man's gaze was like a sharp knife. It felt as if the terrifying aura of a beast was firmly locked on Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen knew that this old man was afraid of the delay. The old man needed to make him refine the star power then and there. But the situation could worsen if Yi Shiwen didn't agree to refine it. He might also get killed. However, he would end being controlled by that old man if he agreed. Yi Shiwen didn't wish to become the puppet of a star colossus. He would rather risk his life to fight with this creature. Then, Yi Mo's voice suddenly reverberated in his mind. Yi Shiwen, say yes. What are you planning? Yi Shiwen asked. I suddenly remember that my master had once established a strange power technique. It is called Heart Seed Devil Method. Yi Mo said, this great technique can grasp the essence and energy of the entire world, and constantly suck them within one's body through the pores. It can then transform into real elemental energy and intensify the condensation of spirit. It can then control the target's mind. It is capable of seizing the world's good fortune and plundering the universe's essence. It is such a mysterious power technique. The most important point is that this power technique itself is based on a magic seed. Yi Mo said, for this Heart Seed Devil Method to work, the most critical step is to find someone with outstanding innate talent and an excellent meditative mind. Then, you need to use them as your very own practice furnace for practicing martial arts. You must dive in the depths of your target's heart in order for this technique to work. This technique will be considered accomplished once the magic seed is sown after going through all variations. However, not everything is detectable in the utter vastness of one's heart. The scenery is beautiful and can be seen as far as one's sight reaches. It extends to infinity, like the nature itself. Sometimes, the sun and moon shines when the sky is clear and windy. Thunder and lightning appear when the thick dense cloud rains. These represent the 7 emotions and 6 desires of a person. They fluctuate unpredictably. Practicing this great technique is like steering a boat in a raging ocean. The boat will sink and people on board will die if you're not careful. It would be beyond redemption if it backfired. The body and soul will be extinguished entirely. This technique doesn't succeed even if it is carried out 100 times after a backfire. However, your martial skill can increase sharply if it succeeds. Moreover, it is important that the magic seeds are sown in people's bodies. You can obtain enormous benefits from those people with the help of those magic seeds. Then you can have quick breakthroughs as well. In fact, you will soon break through into the sage realm if you can sow the magic seeds on the bodies of several experts of sage realm. However, the problem is that, where to find the people I can turn into practice furnace in such a short time? Only this old man was present in front of Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Shiwen couldn't possibly be a match for this enemy. Therefore, he couldn't sow a magic seed inside this enemy's body. Moreover, the most important thing is that I haven't condensed this magic seed yet. It's this star colossus who has condensed it within my body. This magic seed is not a problem. The magic seed hasn't taken root in your body. It hasn't started to germinate yet. There won't be any problem if you can erase his spirit imprint, and instead imprint your own on it. Yi Mo said, the problem of furnace cannot be resolved. There is only one way, you use yourself as a furnace. Then the magic seed can grow by absorbing your power. This technique of yours will also be completed by the time this magic seed matures. Yi Mo blurted out this crazy plan. Yi Shiwen could use himself as a furnace to sow the magic seed. He could allow it take root and then grow gradually using his power. However, this kind of method was also very dangerous. The person who had sown the seed would suffer heavy losses if it were to die. Even Yi Mo's former master had only used his most loyal subordinates as his furnace. His martial skill had enhanced significantly after their deaths. In other words, there would be enormous danger if this power technique was to be practiced in a deceptive fashion. One could die if they weren't careful. Even if practiced properly, one could die because of the magic seed's disintegration. This was so because the person who had sown the magic seed must be willing for it to disintegrate it under these circumstances in order to prevent getting hit by a rebound. Then, the cultivation energies would be transmitted to the body of the person who had sown the magic seed. Therefore, it was often seen that only the most loyal servants were turned into practice furnaces since their masters could control the life and death of their loyal slaves. There was no problem for Yi Shiwen to use himself as a furnace. However, the biggest problem was that he would die if he couldn't practice this power technique properly. In fact, he could die even if he did practice it right. He didn't have a bright future ahead. This was a dead end for him. Yi Ziwen's complexion turned ugly after he had listened to Yi Mo's explanation. But he didn't have any other option at this time. Perhaps the old man would kill Yi Shiwen on the spot if he were to refuse refining the magic seed that was contained in the star power. However, he would become a puppet of this star colossus if he were to refine them. This would be no less than death. In fact, that the old man would be able to peep into his secrets, and whenever he would want Yi Shiwen to die, Yi Shiwen would die. All right then. Yi Shiwen clenched his teeth and said, his only options at hand were to either die or become a puppet. Hence, he decided to put his life on the line. Could be a possibility of finding a way out if he could control the speed of the magic seed's growth. I would never dare to disobey your order. Yi Shiwen cupped his hands in obeisance as he replied to that old man. He was hanging at the edge of a cliff. He would die if he wouldn't comply. Or, he might be left in a situation which would be no less than death. He must fight on to postpone his death. He didn't have any other choice. Very good. That old man's complexion turned benign once he saw Yi Shiwen complying with his command. Perhaps this old man's kind expression could have deceived Yi Shiwen well if he didn't know about this magic seed. This star colossus had lived for God knows how many years. In fact, he should have exhausted his life essence by now. Perhaps Yi Shiwen would have been deceived if it weren't for Yi Mo. Yi Shiwen had no other choice but to sit cross-legged. Yi Mo had instilled the method of practicing heart seed devil technique inside his mind. His mysterious space began to operate frantically. The spirit dawn that he had collected from Luo Yihang's body were brought into play. They began to burn frantically and decomposed into spirit energy. This energy then entered inside Yi Ziwen's mysterious space. He mastered the cultivation method of this technique after burning more than 5 million spirit dawn thanks to his mysterious space. 5 million spirit dawn was a staggering figure for most people. Yi Shiwen started to operate the heart seed devil technique. He discovered that the spiritual power of the star colossus had been secretly attached to the magic seed which was wrapped inside the star power. The magic seed hadn't yet planted itself into his body. However, nothing could be done once it did. Yi Ziwen's spiritual power came in contact with that of the wisp of the star colossus soul, and it frantically began to move within Yi Shiwen. It became crazy and its eyes turned bloodshot. Yi Shiwen snorted. He grabbed that little soul of the star colossus and threw it into the blood pool inside the heavenly source mirror. Roar! Intense rays of light were emitted inside the blood pool. The little star colossus struggled and roared inside the pool. However, it had no scope against the suppression of the heavenly source mirror. Its fate had been sealed as soon as it had entered the blood pool. It had no choice but to get refined. The speed of refining of such a small soul was extremely quick. Yi Shiwen quickly refined it and created his personal star colossus blood slave. Now, this blood slave would be thoroughly obedient to him. There was a chance that the old man might become anxious if he didn't receive any messages from this wisp of his soul. Hence, Yi Shiwen promptly ordered this blood slave to transmit a message to the old man outside. The message would relay that everything was working out as per the old man's plan. That old man watched Yi Shiwen attentively with his knife-like sharp eyes. He could see through that mass of star power that wrapped the magic seed inside. He continued to look at Yi Shiwen as he unceasingly refined this mass of star power. The trace of a satisfied expression appeared on his face as he watched the magic seeds refining. Yi Ziwen's universe began to transform as the star power was absorbed. Mars had been getting condensed inside his solar system with the unceasing inflow of star power. That luminous spot emitted exceptionally brilliant rays of light and attracted huge amounts of star power towards it. Bang! It was hard to tell how long it took, but Mars had been finally condensed inside his body. Clouds began to gather in the sky of the outside world. The heavenly tribulation had arrived for Yi Shiwen yet again. His strength would advance by leaps and bounds if he were to successfully cross this heavenly tribulation. Yi Shiwen didn't move. Rather, he continued to absorb that mass of star power. He hadn't even absorbed 1% of it so far. Its quantity was comparable to the star power present inside a small planet. It would fetch an unimaginable price if it were to be sold. In fact, most people wouldn't even be able to touch it. Yi Shiwen had been unceasingly operating the fifth layer of tyrant body technique. This was the so-called norm of poor people opting to study civil arts, whereas rich opting to study martial arts. Wealth brought enormous benefits to a martial cultivator. The lack of wealthy meant that one wouldn't have sufficient energy to support any type of body tempering technique. For example, Yi Shiwen might barely manage to perfect the first layer of tyrant body technique if he had only relied on his real elemental energy to temper his body. However, Yi Shiwen had been running low on Spirit Dawn these days. He had collected many Spirit Dawn from Luo Yihang's body, but had need them for other things. However, this mass of star power had helped him in resolving his immediate energy crisis. The star power could be considered as far better than the spirit energy derived from Spirit Dawn. And it was far better for tempering his body. Star power was so precious that one couldn't buy this even if they wanted to. This was like the so-called rare iron meteor. This iron meteorite was like a foreign object that had fallen into this mortal world. The iron essence would be extracted from it later, and the iron molded from it would be 100 times better than the ordinary one. That is because the former has been extracted from a meteorite and contains the power of the stars. Yi Shiwen had such an enormous mass of star powers before him at present. So, how could he not rush to temper his tyrant body technique? Yi Shiwen had started to operate the fifth layer of his tyrant body technique along with the absorption of enormous amount of star power. More and more rays of light started to emanate from his body. Even that old man was a bit amazed. A trace of greed could be seen in his eyes. He tried to conceal it, but it still flashed in his eyes. Suddenly, the fierce roars of demon beasts faintly reverberated in the sky. A group of robust and vigorous beastly figures had appeared in the clouds. That lightning beast from last time had returned, and he had brought along 10 more. They looked so frightening that anyone would be terrified to see them. Boom! Yi Ziwen's terrifying aura began to boil up. The fifth layer of the tyrant body technique had been perfected. Chapter 361. Yi Ziwen's aura started to boil, and a strong power galloped within his body. Yi Shiwen had successfully reached the fifth layer of the tyrant body technique. His gestures had become many times stronger even though he hadn't made a breakthrough. The first layer of the tyrant body technique involved perfecting the skin and strengthening it to the toughness of steel. The second layer involved perfecting the flesh and muscles. The third layer involved perfecting the bones. The fourth layer involved perfecting the internal organs. Even if someone were to use their martial power to launch a surprise attack, it would still be impossible for them to injure Yi Ziwen's internal organs once the fourth layer had been perfected. And the fifth layer involved perfecting the meridians. Every martial technique involved the release of real elemental energy to some extent. The more real elemental energy is released, the stronger the might of that technique is. However, the meridians wouldn't be able to withstand the rush of energy and would burst open if they were too weak. Therefore, it was very important to strengthen the meridians. The deduction of the fifth layer of tyrant body technique would be considered completed once the meridians were perfected. He had only practiced this layer to the preliminary level. However, his meridians had become extremely strong, more than double compared to earlier. Yi Ziwen's same techniques would be able to unleash more than double the power. Yi Shiwen had a lot of assurance in his heart compared to the time he had faced the previous heavenly tribulations. The heavenly tribulation had battered him well the last time. He had been thoroughly exhausted and had been put in a difficult situation. However, his strength had increased more than 10 times. Hence, he wasn't worried much. The thought of having a breakthrough had made Yi Shiwen excited, and he was eager to cross this heavenly tribulation. That old man looked at Yi Shiwen in astonishment from the side. Any living creature would be scared to cross this heavenly tribulation. However, Yi Shiwen looked eager to face it. This had transcended the old man's expectation. The old man wasn't aware that Yi Shiwen had been miserably oppressed by this heavenly tribulation the last time. In fact, he had never been oppressed so miserably in his entire life. However, he had somehow beaten it. Therefore, the heavenly tribulation had returned to settle scores. Bang! 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 Heavenly thunders had started to billow in the sky. A group of golden figures appeared in the clouds. The heavenly tribulation looked simpler this time. It didn't resort to unnecessary elements. It had just produced several dozen lightning apes. Their imposing aura had spread across the sky. Their ice-cold killing intention was locked on Yi Shiwen. This horde of several dozen lightning apes was mightier than a magnificent army. This heavenly tribulation was tougher than all previous ones. That old man was somewhat surprised to see this heavenly tribulation. He didn't expect that this heavenly tribulation would be so strange. What kind of person could cross this heavenly tribulation? The more terrifying the person, the more terrifying the heavenly tribulation would be. An ordinary heavenly tribulation would mean that the person it had come for also possessed limited potential. However, a more terrifying heavenly tribulation meant that the person had unlimited potential. Such heavenly tribulations were very frightening, but there was always a way out. There would always be an opportunity to escape death. In other words, such a heavenly tribulation wouldn't have appeared if Yi Zaiwen's strength hadn't reached such heights. This heavenly tribulation was quicker than the one that arrives when an average expert enters the sage realm. Come on! Yi Shiwen clenched his fist. This heavenly tribulation would follow him wherever he'd go. Therefore, he needed to settle this here itself. He took a step and turned into a golden streamer of light. He then penetrated into the tribulation clouds. He hadn't only planned to cross this tribulation, he had also decided to take the first initiative. Yi Shiwen took the initiative and flew towards that horde of lightning apes. This provoked the heavenly tribulation. They roared and rushed towards Yi Shiwen to kill him. Yi Shiwen realized that these lightning apes were somewhat different from the one he had fought earlier. They were far more powerful. Each of them had put forth simple but extremely terrifying martial arts. They had swords, spears, blades, halberds, and also new fist techniques. They exhibited a power so terrifying that it went beyond one's imagination. Yi Shiwen sneered. His strength had increased several times after deducing the 5th layer of the tyrant body technique. He didn't fall weak while he faced the attacks of those lightning apes. He rushed into that horde of lightning apes without any hesitation. Yi Shiwen didn't use any powerful martial arts. An ordinary punch or kick could carry great force as well. This was the so-called act of giving up affectation to regain one's natural state. Yi Shiwen had reached a level of strength wherein his kicks and fists were in line with the principles of Tao. Hence, his attacks were far more terrifying than those of the lightning apes. Yi Shiwen wasn't the strongest in the younger generation, but his understanding of Tao wasn't less than anyone. The reason was simple. He possessed the mysterious space, and he kept deducing the Tao principles. Thus, his understanding of Tao enhanced with each passing second. It was impossible for others to have this factor. However, Yi Shiwen had been relying on it for some time now. He had condensed Mars as well as deduced the 5th layer of tyrant body technique. His strength had become tyrannical, and his understanding of Tao had reached an inconceivable extent. Bang! Yi Shiwen raised his hand to block the attack of a lightning ape. The lightning ape slashed its lightning blade horizontally, and a dreadful power began to boil upon Yi Zaiwen's arm. An ordinary person would have been cleft into two by this blade attack. However, that lightning blade couldn't injure Yi Shiwen. It could only send ripples on his armor of golden divinities. They seemed to spread as if they were on the surface of water. Yi Shiwen turned around and shot his fist. The entire atmosphere started to boil due to the terrifying pressure of the punch. It seemed like it would suppress the heaven itself. Bang! A lightning ape's body had been burst open by Yi Shiwen. It quickly respawned at a different place, but its size had visibly decreased. That was because some of its lightning energy had been absorbed by Yi Shiwen. Yi Zaiwen's strength had increased a little, and that lightning ape's had been weakened. Bang! A lightning ape rushed forward and launched a kick. It literally trod the space and shattered it into pieces. It arrived in front of Yi Shiwen and trampled with a terrifying strength. Yi Shiwen reflexively turned around and grabbed that lightning ape with his hands. The lightning energy scattered from its body but couldn't injure him. Yi Shiwen threw that lightning ape. It almost seemed as if he had treated the ape as a weapon. Bang! Another lightning ape was struck by the one thrown away by Yi Shiwen. It was then split into two halves. Yi Zaiwen's newfound strength was truly horrifying. This scene could have scared anyone to death. The heavenly tribulations were extremely terrifying for most people. They usually practiced for a long time before encountering one. However, the heavenly tribulation turned out to be deadlier every time. All strange heavenly tribulations were extremely terrifying. One could see that each of these lightning apes were exceptionally dreadful. They upheld the will of the heavenly law. Each of these lightning apes could beat the experts at the peak of half-step legendary 9th stage. Their individual strengths didn't differ much from that of Luo Yihang. They rushed to kill Yi Shiwen, all at the same time. Other experts wouldn't come across a heavenly tribulation like Yi Zaiwen's. However, Yi Shiwen was playing with these lightning apes as if they were weapons. Yi Shiwen grabbed a lightning ape as if it were a large blade. The large blade danced in his hand and unexpectedly unleashed a blade technique. It then chopped the other lightning apes in half. However, they were made up of lightning. They quickly respawned. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't discouraged because a significant portion of their innate energy would be absorbed by him every time they'd be chopped in half. They wouldn't be able to fight for long at this rate. Bang! 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 Yi Shiwen brandished that large blade and chopped down those lightning apes. He did this countless times. Eventually, he managed to kill those lightning apes. He then absorbed the lightning ape he had been holding in his hand. Yi Shiwen absorbed every last strand of energy inside the ape's body. He then gave out a loud shout and extended a big golden hand. His hand rose against the wind and turned bigger and bigger as it ascended in the sky. The entire heavenly tribulation clouds fell into his big golden hand. He pinched it, and it exploded. It then turned into a tide of energy, and was then absorbed by Yi Shiwen. Yi Zaiwen's martial power enhanced to a great extent after absorbing the tribulation cloud's energy. A massive amount of energy had gathered inside his body. His aura also rose gradually. He flew in the air and started to operate the observing person's scripture endlessly. An exceptionally intense starlight erupted inside Yi Zaiwen's universe, and it illuminated his entire body. His entire inner universe began to revolve. It had the ability to revolve on its own, just like a small galaxy. This was the reason why he wanted to condense the solar system. However, this merely was the first step and nothing more. His strength would advance by leaps and bounds once he had condensed the entire solar system inside his body. He had this lucky knowledge owing to the virtue of his previous life. He wasn't a part of some high-tech research institute in his past life. He used to be an ordinary person. However, his previous life was set in the era of a massive technical revolution. His knowledge and wisdom were much broader than the people of this world. The indigenous people of this world didn't know the concept of the stars. The world was just limited to the world in their view. Yi Shiwen couldn't have created the observing person scripture without the knowledge from his past life. It was the base of this creation. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's imposing aura had been rising unceasingly. He eventually crossed the barrier and stepped into half-step legendary 7th stage. That flood of energy had shattered the barrier of this stage. Yi Shiwen opened his eyes after a long time. He had entered the half-step legendary 7th stage. He could easily contend with the experts of half-step legendary's great complete realm with his current strength. Notes: Tao/Tao, the absolute principle underlying the universe. It combines the principles of yin and yang, and signifies the way, or code of behavior within itself. Its principles are in harmony with the natural order. Chapter 362. Very good. I have chosen a worthy person. A faint smile appeared on the old man's face when he saw the manner in which Yi Shiwen had crossed the heavenly tribulation. You're more mysterious than I thought. Come, I'll transfer some of my power inside you. You'll reach the heavens in a single jump. I will help you enter the half-step sage realm," that old man said as an evil ray of light flickered in his eyes. "Yi Shiwen, be careful." Yi Amo reminded Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen nodded secretly. He couldn't imagine why this old man would be so kind to him that he would help him level up to the half-step sage realm in one fell swoop. It was only half-step sage realm, but the word sage was attached to it. Yi Shiwen reckoned that it would take him at least 5 to 10 years to enter the semi-sage realm. But did Yi Shiwen have any other option under these circumstances? He had already accepted something as fishy as the magic seed. So he wasn't afraid of anything at this point. Yi Shiwen arrived beside that old man and sat cross-legged. A stream of blood was gushing out from the earth under his body. Boundless energy boiled in that blood which had moistened this stretch of earth. This very earth had given birth to those star beasts. Good, very good. A strange evil light flickered in the eyes of that old man. "You're good to go." That old man roared lightly. Then he instantly shot his big hand, and it went inside Yi Zaiwen's mind. Yi Shiwen sensed that something was wrong. He shouted, "What do you want?" The old man had gone inside Yi Zaiwen's mind. He laughed evilly and said, "Ha ha, I never expected that a human like you would have possessed such a body. Barring those ancient human experts, I'm witnessing such astonishing flesh for the first time. I'll have boundless future prospects if I can temporarily reside inside this body. Haha, I'll finally get out of this damn trap. I'll break out of this trap and release my main body. Then I shall swallow this whole damn world." That old man laughed like a madman. Yi Shiwen coldly looked at that old man. They were both inside his mind at the moment. Yi Shiwen stood on astonishing golden divinities. These golden divinities were surging as unceasingly as the waves in the ocean. There was a chaotic and dusky atmosphere as far as the eyes could see. This place appeared similar to a dantian. It was well-known fact that the so-called human body had 3 dantian regions. One was located in the lower abdomen, the second was inside the chest, and the third inside the mind. And that's where Yi Shiwen had stored his golden divinities. Yi Shiwen could feel the presence of his mysterious space in that dusky atmosphere. He clenched his fist. "You have such an impressive amount of divinities. Have you slaughtered gods?" That old man was extremely surprised to find these many golden divinities rolling inside Yi Zaiwen's mind. He, but these divinities will soon be mine. Weren't you planning to turn me into your puppet? Why did you change your mind so suddenly? Yi Shiwen coldly asked. It was needless to say that he was so angered that he had no reservations for giving face to the old man. He had been very careful thus far, but he eventually ended up speaking his mind. "You knew," the old man exclaimed in surprise. "It seems that you're no fool. I wanted to turn you into my puppet because the body you humans possess is too weak. I could barely instill a wisp of my soul into it. Therefore, the next best thing that I could do was to turn you into a puppet. But I didn't know that your body was so strong. It's on par with the bodies of those ancient experts. I can instill my soul inside your body without any problems." The old man had only intended to control Yi Shiwen as a puppet. But the old man changed his mind after he witnessed Yi Zaiwen's intrepid performance against the heavenly tribulation. He now wanted to seize control of Yi Zaiwen's body through his mind. "I hadn't wished to be on bad terms with you. I'm not kidding. So, you can only blame your luck for this," that old man coldly said. His stature suddenly swooped towards Yi Shiwen. "Your death shall bring success to my supreme cause." The old man's terrifying attack swept over. Yi Shiwen had no choice but to mobilize his divinities to block this attack. Roar! Roar! The divinities under Yi Zaiwen's feet reverse transformed into a terrifying ominous beast. The divinities Yi Shiwen had refined had come from different races. And these races were the descendants of the ancient races of beast gods. The divinities had reverse transformed into a unique ominous beast. It advanced towards that old man to bite him. Bang! 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 That old man suddenly launched an attack. The divinities which had taken the form of an ominous beast were no match for him, and got crushed. He had unleashed the Sage Realm's terrifying strength. Don't struggle. Sincerely allow this old man to swallow you. That old man laughed strangely and said, Yi Mo, begin. Yi Shiwen retreated as he shouted. Suddenly, an astonishing scarlet light blazed out from the surrounding chaos, and maliciously crashed into the old man's body. Bang! The old man was caught off guard by this surprise attack, and a section of his flesh was parched off. However, he regained his composure. He then roared again and again as he rushed towards Yi Shiwen. His complexion had turned fierce. He stretched out his big hand towards Yi Shiwen to grab him, and broke through the protective layers of the golden divinities. Yi Shiwen opened his devil wings, and avoided that old man's attack. They were pursuing and attacking each other inside Yi Ziwen's mind. That old man was only a wisp of the Star Colossus soul, but he possessed the strength of Sage Realm. Yi Shiwen was no match for him. But that old man was somewhat worried. He wanted to seize Yi Ziwen's body, but he didn't wish to injure Yi Shiwen inside his mind space. Any injuries received in this part of the body could be very hard to restore. This was a rarely seen human body, and was capable of holding his soul. And he had made up his mind to take over Yi Ziwen's body. Bang! 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 Their fight had been setting off wild waves of divinities, and these waves kept rising unceasingly, one after another. It was an extremely terrifying scene. Yi Shiwen retreated inside the mysterious space. Boy, you cannot escape. That old man roared and followed Yi Shiwen inside the mysterious space. Die, you old fogey! Yi Shiwen shouted. A multicolored divine beam covered the entire area inside the mysterious space. It seemed as if the mysterious space had sensed a foreign invader and had reacted to their presence. The mysterious space suddenly tensed up and endless rays of light began to spread. The old man realized that something was wrong. He figured that he might have fallen into Yi Ziwen's trap. He hadn't paid any attention to Yi Ziwen's strength. Any plan or scheme was like fleeting clouds in front of his Sage Realm's tyrannical strength. It was radically impossible for Yi Shiwen to injure that old man even if he were to have the strength of Semi-Sage Realm. That multicolored divine beam wrapped the old man. He couldn't free himself no matter how much he struggled. Meanwhile, Yi Shiwen was crazily burning Spirit Dawn. He was consuming more than 10 Spirit Dawn every second. The strength of this Star Colossus was far beyond his imagination. Perhaps he was only one step away from entering the Great Sage Realm. That Star Colossus was so strong that it would be very difficult to imprison him for long, even if Yi Shiwen were to push the mysterious space to its limits. After all said and done, Yi Ziwen's strength was indeed far inferior to the old man's. He had discovered that this mysterious space's intervention was little to none while he was fighting with the old man outside. However, the mysterious space would react ferociously whenever there was a psychic invasion. Shwa! A red-colored shackle flew out and penetrated that old man's body. It locked around that old man's collarbone. He bellowed, but he was entirely wrapped in that multicolored divine beam. He couldn't move. It seemed as if he was caught in quagmire. There was no way for him to move. He roared repeatedly. However, he couldn't do anything since his collarbone had been locked by the red spirit chain. His magical powers had also been sealed by the chain. His real form had been revealed since his powers had been subdued. He was a giant monster. Fish-like black scales covered his entire body. Its massive tail was waving vigorously. It had 4 strong hooves. Fortunately, this was his soul state. The size would have been beyond imagination if it had been its real body. Yi Shiwen found it hard to imagine the real size of a monster that could devour stars. Yi Shiwen heaved a sigh of relief once he saw that the old man had been chained. He then shouted, Yi Mo, I'm throwing him inside the blood pool. I'd like to turn him into a blood slave. Yi Shiwen had been forced into tough situations by this old man, again and again. So much so that he had turned himself into a furnace to practice Heart Seed Devil method. He had been set down a road from where he couldn't return. So, he was furious and couldn't restrain his anger anymore. Young man, you will die a dog's death once my true body comes out. I'll massacre your entire true martial world. The Star Colossus prototype roared. He was unwilling to give up. He had always known everything to be in his control. He had lived for thousands of years. He wasn't some young and inexperienced creature. He was skilled in planning rigorous schemes and possessed deep foresight. He would calculate and fortify every step of his plan before he'd proceed with it. He had put all his effort even while facing Yi Shiwen, a youngster whose strength was much inferior to his own. He had never believed in leaving loopholes. However, he had never calculated that something like this mysterious space would exist inside Yi Ziwen's mind. An item like this mysterious space went against the heaven's will. It had jeopardized his plan and had pushed him into a very perilous situation. You're paralyzed, yet you dream of coming out? Try in the next life. Yi Shiwen kicked him. Yi Ziwen's kick wouldn't have budged him if it had been his real body. However, this was a wisp of the beast's soul, nothing more. Hence, he restrained himself from kicking the star colossus to death. Yi Mo pulled at that star colossus after he heard Yi Ziwen's words, and threw him into the blood pool. Roar! The star colossus roared in pain as he entered the blood pond. His constant struggles set off gigantic waves in the blood pool. But how could Yi Mo possibly allow him to escape? The star colossus had been shackled in the chains. The chains had pierced his body and had made several large holes in it. And the star colossus energy was being gradually transferred from these holes and into Yi Ziwen's body through the chains. Half-step legendary 9th stage, half-stage legendary 9th peaks, half-stage legendary's great complete realm, semi-sage realm, half-step sage realm, sage first stage. Treat half-step legendary realm as legendary realm itself. That's because true geniuses choose to stay within half-step legendary realm and treat it like a replacement for legendary realm. The pinnacle of half-step legendary realm is semi-sage realm. It's called semi-sage realm because the next breakthrough will basically take you across 10 stages at once and you will directly reach the pinnacle of legendary realm. But what's the pinnacle of legendary realm? Check out the hierarchy below. Legendary first stage, legendary 9th stage, legendary 9th peak, legendary's great complete realm, half-step sage realm. Yes, the pinnacle of legendary realm is half-step sage realm. In other words, the old man is offering Yi Shiwen to help him insta-reach the half-step sage realm. Then he will be only half a step away from becoming a sage expert. Chapter 363. There was a fight ensuing between two groups of experts on the outside. The experts of the Sword Tomb had gradually fallen into the disadvantageous position under the relentless and strategic attacks of the experts of the Xianyuan Palace Hall. In fact, the Sword Tomb was on the verge of defeat. However, the Sword Tomb's experts were usually very aggressive. Perhaps they would have been routed by now if not for the consistency of their fierce sword attacks. But their situation didn't seem very optimistic despite their vigor. The wolf cub had sustained many wounds on his body. He was experiencing battles which were far more brutal compared to the others since the disciples of the Xianyuan Palace Hall had brought various ominous beasts as their mounts. These beasts had joined forces and had thereby increased their group's overall strength. Dangers sprang up at the wolf cub from everywhere since he was faced with the attacks of those ominous beasts. Meanwhile, the other people of the Sword Tomb were too busy in taking care of themselves, and were failing at it as well. The experts of the Sword Tomb were all sword experts. A sword expert's only companion was their sword. Other things could be considered as burdens. Hence, their demeanor was naturally understandable. You might have all sorts of tricks and methods, but my sword can break through 10,000 techniques. A mount wasn't necessary for the sword experts. Consequently, the wolf cub was forced to single-handedly resist the attacks from those ominous beasts of the Xianyuan Palace Hall. His miraculous abilities had surprised everyone. One must know that the ominous beasts which had been brought by these Xianyuan Palace Hall's disciples didn't have blood relations with the ancient mythological beasts. They didn't carry the blood of ancient ominous beasts. Yet, each of them was extraordinarily wise, and it was difficult to find their match. However, they had found a fierce, weird and foul-mouthed opponent in this wolf cub. In fact, he was so ferocious that even the slightest lapse in caution had costed their lives in this fight. The wolf cub had miraculous abilities, but the opposite party many ominous beasts. Therefore, it was bound to be difficult for him to deal with so many enemies at once. Soon, the wolf cub had sustained various wounds, and blood had started to gush out from them. Motherfucker! These guys are despicable. They launched a sneak attack on this prince. The wolf cub commented in his usual foul-mouthed manner. However, this hadn't slowed him down. Thanks to his outstanding agility skill, he was ahead of those ominous beasts. In fact, he might been dead by now if he didn't possess such an amazing agility skill. In fact, many disciples of the Xianyuan Palace Hall had started to harbor thoughts of catching the wolf cub. They wanted to raise him as a pet. After all, he was the descendant of an extraordinary demon beast. To raise him as a pet would be a matter of pride. Jian Wuchen and Mu Ling were completely invested in dealing with their respective opponents. Therefore, they couldn't assist the wolf cub. Other people didn't even think of helping it since their own opponents were very formidable. But it was the sword sage who was in the most dangerous situation. He was constantly under attack by Fan Ming. The sword sage had entered half-step legendary's Great Complete Realm. But Fan Ming was at the peak of half-step legendary Great Complete Realm. He had attained a higher cultivation level. However, the sword sage had somehow survived owing to his outstanding abilities. An average person of the same level would have been dead by now. Welcome your death obediently. No one can save you. Fan Ming coldly announced to the sword sage. Isn't your Xianyuan Palace Hall worried that the true martial university will find out about this? The sword sage asked in reply. He had fallen into the disadvantageous position, but he didn't show a shred of weakness. Humph, no one will ever find out that this was the Xianyuan Palace Hall's doing once you guys are dead. Fan Ming responded in a carefree manner. No one would be able to determine that this had been done by the Xianyuan Palace Hall once these people had been killed and the clues were wiped clean. In fact, it was possible that the true martial university might never come to know about this underground world. The matter of these people's demise would become an eternal secret in that case. It's a grand plan indeed, a loud voice suddenly sounded. It was followed by a startling sword intention that appeared out of nowhere. Buried person sword, a loud shout resounded. The sword intention released countless principles of Tao and turned into a sword light. It then swept down. This scary sword intention had torn the space open. It had swept down ferociously and had set off a terrifying energy storm. Bang! 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 The Xianyuan Palace Hall's disciple who came in its path got cleft into two. They died on the spot. Several experts didn't get any time to resist. They perished in an instant. They didn't have the strength to fight back. 5 among these slaughtered people were at half-step legendary 9th stage. These experts were considered as elites among elites in the Xianyuan Palace Hall. They didn't have the reputation equal to that of Fan Ming, but they were considered seed disciples nonetheless. It was not because they were one step behind a first-grade genius like Fan Ming. It was because they might never be able to fill this gap of one step. It was a disparity between their talent and opportunity. They'd be considered top-notch talents if they could cross this step. They'd then enjoy the best treatment. However, they'd only be considered as second-grade geniuses if they weren't be able to cross this step. Moreover, there was a huge difference in strength. Who was that? Fan Ming shouted in a cold voice. He was startled by that sudden sword-light attack. He didn't know who had attacked him from behind. He couldn't fathom who'd dare to disturb him. You Xianyuan Palace Hall disciples are too arrogant. A strong voice reverberated. Then, a slim figure emerged from behind the layers of space. He towed the long sword intention that had cut open the space. The sword sage saw Yi Shiwen, and a bright light flashed in his eyes. However, he didn't say anything. His entire body was clad in a black cloak. Therefore, one couldn't see his facial expression. Who are you? Fan Ming looked towards Yi Shiwen and asked. You don't need to know that. A dead person doesn't need to know much. Yi Shiwen sneered and replied. Boy, thank God you've arrived at the right time. Otherwise, this prince would have been ganged up and killed by these shameless bastards. Wolf Cub stated in his usual full-mouthed manner. Yi Shiwen ignored the wolf cub. Jian Wuchen and Mu Ling were pleasantly surprised to see Yi Shiwen. Only Bao Qin Wang's expression turned complicated upon seeing Yi Shiwen in the Sword Tomb's team. He was happy and confused. He was happy because he knew that Yi Shiwen possessed terrifying strength. Everyone had witnessed the manner in which Yi Shiwen had struck down those disciples of the Xianyuan Palace Hall in one move. However, the enemy commander looked even more terrifying. Yet, those enemies had been killed by Yi Shiwen in one move. The Sword Tomb's chance of winning would increase greatly if Yi Shiwen were to lend help. However, he was confused because they had an enmity with Yi Shiwen, and now they needed to rely on Yi Shiwen for the sake of their lives. Hence, he had no choice but to feel confused. In fact, Yi Shiwen didn't have a favorable opinion of the Sword Tomb. The Sword Tomb had a reputation of being an organization for sword cultivators. However, he had had too many differences with them. Yi Shiwen bore these things in his mind as well. He wasn't on good with terms with either of the two sides. Hence, he didn't want to help the either. In fact, he might have waited till one side was annihilated if Jian Wuqin, Mu Ling, and Wolf Cub weren't in the Sword Tomb's team. How courageous! Fan Ming smiled instead of getting furious. No one had dared to speak to him in this manner since the time he had set foot on the road of martial arts. And those who did were already dead. It had been a long time since someone had dared to be disrespectful towards him. Bang! Fan Ming shot the long spear he had held. The tyrannical spear point pierced through the space as it rushed towards Yi Shiwen. Whoosh! The terrifying spear point had cracked the space, and it broke apart into countless pieces. It was almost as if the space was made of the same material as that of glass. Yi Shiwen shot his sword intention in retaliation. It swept out an incredible sword light in the sky. Bang! The world between the heaven and earth had been shattered. The terrifying battle between these two had swept away more than half of the space. The gray-colored chaos on the other side had started to leak in. This battle was more terrifying than the one between Fan Ming and Sword Sage. The individual strengths of these two were far more than that of the Sword Sage. Fan Ming had reached the realm of man-spear unification. In fact, he himself seemed like a long spear. Yi Shiwen hadn't achieved the realm of man-sword unification, but his sword attacks were more powerful. He wasn't holding a real sword in his hand. He had merely created a sword using Dao. Yi Shiwen followed the Dao of martial arts, whereas the sword art was only one of the many arts in the way of martial arts. Hence, the sword art was incapable of dominating Yi Ziwen's future practice. The sword intention danced vertically and horizontally in the space. It seemed powerful enough to break the heaven. Fan Ming's killing intention had started to produce real fire. Every time the spear rotated in his hands, it would cut open the vast sky and collapse the surrounding space. He was extremely powerful. He had unleashed the entire strength of half-step Legendary's great complete realm. He had forced the Sword Sage into a disadvantageous position. However, he hadn't displayed his full strength. Sword Sage was the top sword expert of this generation. He had entered half-step Legendary's great complete realm at a very young age. He had boundless future prospects. However, the Sword Sage had induced out even more terrifying power from Fan Ming than usual because he was an outstanding genius. Consequently, the outstanding Sword Sage had been suppressed by Fan Ming. Fan Ming's ice-cold eyes were extremely scary. His chilling long spear could make people tremble with fear. It caused the destruction and rebirth of the space it passed through. Even an ordinary spear would display the greatest might if placed in his hands, since he had practiced his spear skill to the pinnacle. In fact, his skill was very close to the Dao. His spear was just like a wheeling disc that was set to grind the living creatures of this entire world. However, Yi Shiwen couldn't be taken lightly. His strength had increased enormously after he had condensed Mars in his inner solar system. Increasing strength was far more difficult for Yi Shiwen than it was for an average person. However, his strength increased far more than an average person's would upon a successful encounter. The Sword Sage was at the half-step Legendary's great complete realm, but his strength couldn't be compared with Yi Ziwen's. Clang! 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 Fan Ming's wheeling spear clashed against the long sword that had been condensed from Yi Ziwen's sword intention. Sparks flew about. Their attacks were extremely fast. It was difficult to track their movements with naked eyes. However, the clash of their attacks unleashed a destructive force large enough to smash mountains into pieces. The Sword Tomb's people promptly retreated to a safe distance. They were dumbstruck by this battle. They didn't dare to approach the two fighters since their battle strength was astonishing, and their might was extremely terrifying. Notes: Buried Person Sword. It is the first move of Buried Sword Secrets, which is also called Sword Code. Chapter 364. The strength of these two individuals was far beyond everyone's imagination. These people were elites in their own accord. But their strengths were far inferior to these two fighters. They were even stronger than the Sword Sage. Naturally, there was a difference of heaven and earth in the strengths of other people when compared to these two. These people wouldn't be able to block a single move if they were a part of this fight. Everyone present on the scene wasn't just dumbstruck. They were scared and apprehensive in their hearts. Those two were experts of the younger generation, yet there still existed such a huge disparity between their strength and that of the others. The space was fluctuating like the water surface due to the attacks of both parties. They were putting the entirety of their efforts and were unleashing their incredible powers. The real elemental energy was boiling majestically within their bodies. Everyone had realized that their life and death was dependent on Yi Shiwen. They would perish if he were to be defeated and killed. But would they remain safe if he were to come out victorious? Their attacks had thoroughly shattered the space. They weren't regarded as great lofty figures yet, but they had set off huge vibrations in the space. They were constantly attacking each other and were unleashing their miraculous powers. It seemed as if a sea of energy had surged to engulf everything. Bang! The vault of the heaven had been cracked open and their attacks were breaching the space. Fang Ming's facial expression had turned exceptionally fierce. He had always been considered as the topmost young figure in the Xianyuan Palace Hall. He had never been treated this way. The look of disdain flashing on Yi Ziwen's face was unacceptable to him. Die! Fan Ming swept out his spear. An endless amount of spear energy rushed forth and blotted out the entire sky. Countless energy spears made up of Dao started to patrol at his side. These spears opened up black cracks in the sky wherever they went. Each of these black cracks was extremely terrifying, and they rushed towards Yi Shiwen to kill him. You're at a wrong today, and am doing the good deed. You've killed so many our disciples. You've committed a crime that cannot be forgiven. You must die. Fan Ming roared. Yi Shiwen saw the energy spears blotting out the sky, but his complexion didn't change. He seemed a bit excited on the contrary. His entire body got covered in golden light and started to glow like an ancient god. I've killed many geniuses, but I've not killed the top geniuses in this territory yet. Yi Shiwen burst into laughter. He then launched an attack while surfing on the golden divine waves. It could be said that their skills had reached close to the concept of Tao. The complementary waves generated during their battle were powerful enough to split the space. Their powers had reached the pinnacle of the half-step legendary realm. In fact, they exhibited a trace of the power of the sage realm. Yi Ziwen's divine waves boiled under his foot. Every step he took made the space tremble. It seemed as if he could cause a quake in the empty space. The space was gradually trod to pieces by Yi Ziwen's steps. The long sword in his hand released astonishing sword energy in every direction. His aura was so scary that it would make people believe that the sword god himself had taken birth. An average slash of his sword had split open the thick layer of earth. The crust of earth was first stirred up and then quelled by the attack. It had seemed like an average sword move without much style. Yet its massive power had crushed a thick layer of earth. Nothing could resist this attack. This was the second move of Buried Sword Secrets. It was called the Buried Earth Sword. Yi Shiwen wasn't parsimonious in burning the Spirit Dawn since there wasn't much time. But he had managed to deduce only up to the second move of Buried Sword Secrets. However, he was far from the level of perfection. His understanding of the move had reached a considerably high level at the most. The power displayed was extremely dreadful even though he had only achieved the high level. Nothing could survive under the crushing impact of this terrifying sword move. The spear technique practiced by Fan Ming was also difficult to deal with. He would shoot the energy spears, and they would spread like starlight. They'd cause the surrounding space to collapse. Then they'd fly far away into the distance and tear the endless abyss of darkness. Bang! A horrifying explosion resounded, and the surrounding space began to tremble. Many disciples of Sword Tomb were dumbstruck by this. They couldn't have withstood such terrifying attacks. They might have been just 1 or 2 levels inferior to these two, but this was enough to create a difference of heaven and earth. These two are terrifying. They are the experts of the younger generation, but we're no match for them. Coming across such individuals in this lifetime, I'm not sure whether we're fortunate or unfortunate. We're not the strongest ones. We'll most likely end up becoming the bones to pave their road to invincibility. Their discussion hadn't finished yet. However, the fight between Yi Shiwen and Fan Ming had entered a superheated stage. Fan Ming held his long spear as he rushed towards Yi Shiwen like a peerless warrior. He forged ahead as he destroyed everything in his path. His boundless imposing aura had set off an incredible storm. Yi Ziwen's sword intention began to wrap up in his divinities. The sword intention integrated with the divinities and began to boil. It then shot towards Fan Ming. Bang! This was a world-shaking attack. The two insanely powerful energy storms collided in the sky and scattered in every direction. Many half-step legendary 7th-stage experts of the Sword Tomb were blown away by the fearful force of the shock wave. The terrifying shock wave swept towards Yi Ziwen's body, but couldn't budge him. That was because his comprehension of tyrant body technique had reached the 5th layer. Fan Ming retreated several steps. He had sustained some internal injuries due to that terrifying shock wave, and nearly spurted out blood from his mouth. Yi Shiwen recovered very quickly. Consequently, he quickly rushed over. He attacked again, and went all out this time. The sword intention condensed into a sword, and swept down. The buried earth sword conveniently appeared in his hand in the blink of an eye, and rolled downward to crush its target. Fan Ming only got enough time to block. However, how he could block such an attack? He was pressed down by the terrifying power, and was sent flying. Bang! He went flying into a mountain, and came to a halt only when he crashed into the mountain's peak. Several of his bones had been crushed into fine powder by Yi Ziwen's sword power. The experts of Sword Tomb became excited as they witnessed Yi Shiwen gain the upper hand. They would survive only if Yi Shiwen would have an upper hand in the battle. The mountain was severed and crushed into pieces. The dust and smoke soared up into the sky. Fan Ming was baffled since he had never thought that his attack would be so destructive. He had never imagined that it would leave him in such a miserable state. He was confident that he was unmatched in the younger generation. Even the prominent experts in the Xianyuan Palace Hall weren't worthy opponents in his eyes. He considered himself invincible, and thought that he would be able to obtain the supreme position while he walked this road, sooner or later. However, he had never expected that this attack would help Yi Shiwen to obtain the indisputably advantageous position. Fan Ming had looked down upon Yi Shiwen. He had never imagined that Yi Shiwen would suppress him like this. He was arrogant prior to this attack, and had carried an aloof appearance, as if he was the best in the world. He didn't even consider the disciples of the Xianyuan Palace Hall of his generation as worthy of his acknowledgement. Let alone the disciples of the true martial university, he merely considered them to hail from a university that had declined long ago. In fact, he was aware that several famous disciples of the true martial university weren't present here. The Sword Sage or Luo Yiheng weren't even close to being his opponent since they were only at half-step legendary 9th stage. This had made him look down on the true martial university even more. He naturally hadn't thought that he'd end up suffering such a heavy defeat at the hands of Yi Shiwen. However, he didn't have the luxury to think more on this topic at this juncture. He moved slowly since the severe pain made him gasp. He promptly used his secret healing technique to restore some of his injuries. Then he held his spear and rushed towards Yi Shiwen again. The long spear became bigger and bigger in the sky. It soon started to appear like a giant dragon. It rushed towards Yi Shiwen and applied its massive suppression force on him. This resulted in sonic boom which reverberated in all directions. One could tell that Fan Ming hadn't held back this time. It was needless to say that Yi Ziwen's terrifying strength had forced into taking this action. Anyone with eyes could clearly see that he no longer dared to underestimate Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen was very calm. But he wasn't willing to go easy on Fan Ming. Yi Shiwen had managed to thoroughly suppress, but with great difficulty. He couldn't possibly allow Fan Ming an opportunity to make a comeback. The sword intention appeared in his hand, and emitted sword energy that swept out towards Fan Ming and pressed him down. Boom! The terrifying clash between the two set off layer upon layers of energy waves. They swept across the surroundings and applied a suppression which caused the space to collapse. The shock waves also swept out towards those two. Yi Shiwen didn't care since his body was extremely tyrannical. He charged inside those shock waves of energy and crossed it unhurt. However, Fan Ming was prepared this time. He drew back to avoid these terrifying energy waves. Yi Shiwen started to chase Fan Ming again. His body was far more tyrannical than Fan Ming's. He was fiercer and unbridled because of this. Fan Ming had to pay attention to several aspects while Yi Shiwen was constantly tempting him to fight. However, he didn't dare to engage Yi Shiwen head-on. Yi Ziwen's approach was different. On the contrary, he was trying to find a way to engage the enemy in a decisive face-to-face battle. Yi Shiwen firmly believed that he should be able to defeat his opponent in a few moves. The outcome of a battle depended on several aspects, strength being one of them. But Yi Shiwen had an overwhelming advantage since he possessed an intrepid body. Poisonous dragon impales. Fan Ming shouted angrily. Suddenly, his spear evolved into a poisonous dragon. A massive amount of spirit energy congregated on the long spear as it arrived in front of Yi Shiwen to bite him to death. Suddenly, a fine light flickered in Yi Ziwen's eyes. He had finally spotted Fan Ming's flaw. It was obvious that Fan Ming hadn't practiced this poisonous dragon impales move to the pinnacle. It contained massive power, but it had exposed his weakness. Indeed, it was merely a very small flaw, but this little chink was big enough for Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen brandished his long sword. It blossomed into a sword beam and routed the incoming poisonous dragon impale's attack. It then pierced its way through the spear energy and advanced forward. Puchi! The sword intention eventually impaled Fan Ming's body. His body exploded and poured down as a rain of blood. Chapter 365. Half a month's time had passed. A major event of the True Martial University had taken place. The university's original intention was to test the new disciples' abilities in the trials organized in the foreign battlefield. However, this trial had ended up in the discovery of the sealed underground place where Star Colossus, the main offender who was responsible for the decline of the True Martial University, was imprisoned. The nearby space had been sealed since then. It would have been possible to use transportation portals to go inside that underground world. However, the entire place had become the True Martial University's restricted zone. It became clear from oral accounts of the disciples who had managed to come out alive that the Xianyuan Palace Hall had sent a faction of their disciples into the True Martial University's territory and had slaughtered many of the True Martial University's disciples. This matter had made the entire higher authority of the True Martial University furious. They had furiously decided to launch a full-scale attack on the Xianyuan Palace Hall. However, later the envoy of the Xianyuan Palace Hall's faction arrived to meet with the Lord of the University in private. The price they had to pay in order to quell the True Martial University's rage remained a mystery. The strength of the True Martial University and the Xianyuan Palace Hall was almost the same. Moreover, the True Martial University was within their rights in this situation. Therefore, nobody would stand on the Xianyuan Palace Hall's side since they had acted very cheaply. Many forces had risen abruptly after the decline of the True Martial University. These forces had mutually divided their territories, and they could not invade each other's area of dominion. Moreover, the very core of this newcomers' trial competition was to determine who among these new disciples would become the pillars of the True Martial University in the future. But the Xianyuan Palace Hall's disciples had slaughtered many disciples of the True Martial University. How could this not have increased their anger to the utmost? The Xianyuan Palace Hall's loss was naturally greater. The mere loss of Fan Ming was equal to the overall losses of the true martial university, since such disciples were very rare to come by. The true martial university had lost a very few capable disciples. But the Xian Yuan Palace's losses were much higher in this regard. Yet, people had ignored this point in its entirety. And the Xian Yuan Palace Hall had to face the consequence of their bad deeds. They could only blame themselves for blowing off their cover by failing to carry out this task in secrecy. These trials were supposed to continue for years' time. But the unexpected discovery of the underground seal caused this term's trials to end ahead of time. And everyone earned points and rewards in accordance with their performance. The tyrannical disciples had been promoted to core disciples. Those with outstanding performance were made inner disciples. And those with average performance were made outer disciples. Only the powerhouses of Sage Realm were eligible to become core disciples under normal circumstances. But Yi Shiwen was promoted to the rank of core disciple since his outstanding performance had single-handedly ruined the Xianyuan Palace Hall's plot. In fact, there were some among the upper echelon who had demanded to make an exception and promote Yi Shiwen to the rank of a true disciple since his contribution had been very deserving. It could be said that he had single-handedly thwarted the Xianyuan Palace Hall's elaborate plan. This demonstrated that his meritorious service was indeed enough. It was sufficient to make an exception and make him a true disciple. However, a part of the higher authority collectively criticized this idea. Meritorious service was one thing, but his current strength was far insufficient to become a core disciple. Only the disciples of Sage Realm could be made core disciples. They were literally breaking the rule by making this exception and ranking him as a core disciple. But the proposition to make him a true disciple was insane in their eyes. Only the experts of Great Sage Realm could become true disciples and enjoy the distinguished treatment. The disparity in Yi Zaiwen's strength when compared to theirs was too big. However, the most important thing was that Yi Shiwen hadn't yet displayed his full potential. This was his flaw in this regard. The disciples in the half-step legendary stage were tested to see if they could become peerless geniuses in the future and how big their accomplishment would be. The half-step legendary realm was to test the disciples and make a prediction about their future prospects. The more tyrannical a genius was, the farther he could walk. Yi Shiwen had merely reached the half-step legendary 7th stage. He still had to cultivate further in order to be treated as an elite disciple according to the standards of true martial university. A person could be considered as a genius worthy of investing resources into if they could reach the half-step legendary 9th stage. Many resources would incline towards the said individual then, but only then. The true martial university would incline many resources towards them to help with their cultivation if one would match this criterion of university. He could then make a breakthrough into half-step legendary's great complete realm. This was done with the intention to nurture them into the future pillars of the university. Yi Zaiwen's strength had skipped levels to beat a far stronger opponent. It had attracted the attention of some higher authorities, but none paid much attention to it. After all, what kind of a genius wouldn't have the ability to display the power of higher cultivation level? Many experts had done this during the battles on the ancient road on their path of join true martial university. Yi Zaiwen's strength had indeed skipped a few levels with respect to his real cultivation level, but it wasn't impossible to achieve. Some people relied on divine tools, and some relied on various others means to achieve a considerable rise in their power. In fact, some could even achieve the same degree of rise in their power as Yi Shiwen had. Taking the help of external means to reduce the gap in levels wasn't the right path in the eyes of high-level authorities, nor did it represent that Yi Shiwen had enough potential. There was a possibility that he would get stuck at half-step legendary 7th stage forever. Then, his future achievements would be negligible since the pinnacle of Great Sage Realm would be out of his reach. There could be a verifiable possibility of stepping into the Great Sage Realm once he made a breakthrough to half-step legendary 9th stage. Moreover, one could get a hint of a person's future potential in the half-step legendary realm. It couldn't be guaranteed that the future would be the same as anticipated since every person had their own fortuitous encounters to credit. However, these guesses turned out to be accurate most of the times. Yi Shiwen had made a great meritorious service. However, many high-level authorities believed that he hadn't displayed enough potential. It wouldn't be appropriate in their opinion if he would be hastily promoted to the rank of a true disciple. The high-level experts of law enforcement Hall had especially made every effort to prevent his promotion. Eventually the topic to make Yi Shiwen a true disciple had been left unsettled. Of course, these were just gossips. Different people had different opinions on the matter. No one knew what the higher authorities had discussed. However, Yi Ziwen's fame skyrocketed after the news spread out. His reputation had risen steeply inside True Martial University. It had come to rival the fame of those genuine disciples who were called Heaven's Pride. Haha, I am really happy. Yi Shiwen didn't have big reputation before. However, he killed a formidable expert of the Xianyuan Palace Hall. The Xianyuan Palace Hall's plan backfired this time, and they've suffered a huge loss. They have no choice but to swallow their pride and bear it. Indeed, the Xianyuan Palace Hall had made an elaborate plot. All the disciples of the True Martial University may have perished if Yi Shiwen had been there. Fan Ming was used as a stepping stone. It has raised our True Martial University reputation. We now have two formidable geniuses of the Heaven's Pride level. First one is that sword sage who has established the Sword Tomb Ground. He made a breakthrough into half-step Legendary's great complete realm to enter the level of the Heaven's Pride. And the second one is that Yi Shiwen. He is clearly a monster. Fan Ming had an illustrious reputation inside the Xianyuan Palace Hall. He was a prominent disciple of the Heaven's Pride level. But even he died at Yi Ziwen's hands. I can tell that Yi Shiwen will have boundless future prospects. We have disciples like the Titan Body Guy, the one with Heavenly Phoenix Body, Hanbin Wang, Honorable Senior Guang Ming, Qin Wang, Huang Jinshi, Sword Sage, and Yi Shiwen. There are a total of 8 Heaven's Pride disciples, and they all possess the strength of half-step Legendary's great complete realm. There has never been this many in the previous generations. It is too early to say that. Yi Ziwen's fighting strength is equal to half-step Legendary's great complete realm. It is astonishing, but his future is uncertain. What will be the use of his present strength if he fails to make a breakthrough into the half-step Legendary's great complete realm? His strength is comparable to that of those other experts of the Heaven's Pride level, but what will happen if he fails to make further breakthroughs? The gap will only widen in the future. Then, he'll end up becoming a laughing stock. Some people were discontented with the sudden rise in Yi Ziwen's reputation. So, they mocked his name around. Yi Shiwen didn't care about the UPS and-downs because he was too busy with something else. Countless people had challenged him in the days following his rise to fame. The other members of the well-known 8-peak experts, who were called Heaven's Pride, were confirmed to have reached the half-step Legendary's great complete realm. Moreover, they could even challenge people above their own level. They would only find trouble if they would come across an expert of semi-sage realm. But they were unmatched in their level. Consequently, everyone knew that they couldn't go to them asking for trouble. However, Yi Shiwen was the exception. He had been designated the title of Heaven's Pride. But he was only at half-step Legendary 7th stage. There were many new disciples with the same strength. And many people couldn't bear the sudden rise of his fame. In fact, there were many who believed that he didn't deserve this fame. These people were top geniuses of their regions. They were okay with disciples of half-step Legendary's great complete realm being called Heaven's Pride. But they couldn't accept that someone like Yi Shiwen had obtained the same title. Who was he in front of them? He wasn't even that famous earlier. How did he become so famous suddenly? Yi Shiwen had risen to fame because he had killed Fan Ming. The man used to be a Heaven's Pride level disciple of the Xianyuan Palace Hall. However, everyone thought that Yi Shiwen had grabbed a cheap bargain because Fan Ming had been injured by the Sword Sage. Yi Shiwen didn't have any outstanding abilities in their eyes. He was no big deal. It was hard for them to accept this fact. Many people thought that they could surpass Yi Shiwen. They wanted to use him as their stepping stone. However, how he could allow them to succeed that easily? He was no pushover to begin with. He tidied up about a dozen elites who boasted illustrious reputation in order to scare the others off. In fact, he had wiped the floor with these elites. The experts who had posed as so-called elite geniuses weren't even able to withstand a single move of Yi Zaiwen's. More than a dozen people of half-step legendary 9th stage were unable to stop Yi Zaiwen's one move. Their strength was marginally lower than that of Luo Yihang and Sword Sage. However, they hadn't been able to withstand even a single move of his. This had frightened everyone. Yi Shiwen got several days of peace after this incident. Yi Shiwen didn't pay any little attention towards those rumors and slanders. In fact, he wouldn't have bothered to engage them if not to deter and scare off the others. Yi Shiwen had a desire to fight with experts from all over the world, but only if the enemy would be a top-tier powerhouse. He had no interest in fighting average experts. However, he wasn't disturbed after this incident. He might not have great fighting strength like those other Heaven's Pride title holders, but he could easily tidy the rest of them up. Everyone had come to understand this clearly. Yi Shiwen didn't care about the rumors. He continued to refine that star colossus into a blood slave. Yi Zaiwen's overall strength had at most reached the half-step legendary's great complete realm, and his real cultivation was at half-step legendary 7th stage. The refining process of this star colossus went far beyond the scope of his present cultivation level. Notes: Han Bing Wang equals Cold Ice King. De Guang Ming equals Great Radiance. Huang Jin Shi equals Golden Lion. Chapter 366. Roar. 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 Violent roars emanated from the blood pond. The star colossus body twisted and turned in the boiling blood pond. Layer upon layer of blood waves splashed out from the pond. Damn it. Oi, I won't forgive you for this. The star colossus roared. Yi Shiwen stood outside the blood pond. He stared at that star colossus with his ice-cold eyes. His refusal to accept defeat wasn't very surprising. It would have been impossible for Yi Shiwen to capture the star colossus without the mysterious space's intervention. Moreover, he couldn't kill it even though he had caught it. He could only use this method to scrape off its power, bit by bit. Yi Shiwen recalled how he had been forced by this bastard to refine the devil seed inside his body. Suddenly, anger flourished in his heart. Try to say it again once you come out. It'll turn you into the most loyal blood slave. Yi Shiwen clenched his teeth as coldly looked at the star colossus. How long will it take to refine it? Yi Shiwen turned around and asked DMO. It's only a wisp of the real star colossus soul, but its strength is at the pinnacle of the sage realm. It's one step away from the great sage realm. It can be possible to refine it only if you're in the sage realm. DMO said. Yi Shiwen slightly frowned. Even 5 years wouldn't be enough for him to enter the semi-sage realm to his current speed of progress. You cannot kill me. It'll cause a bloodbath in your damn world once my main body comes out. The star colossus roared. Is there no other way? Yi Shiwen asked. There is a way. You can use this star colossus energy to refine it into your blood slave. That's a possible way because this wisp of its soul is connected to its real soul. So, you can draw energy from its real body. It is quite simple. But you'll need great amount of Spirit Dawn for that. In fact, more than 50 million Spirit Dawn are required to refine a mere semi-sage level blood slave. Yi Mo spoke after doing a bit of calculation. Yi Mo obviously knew that Yi Shiwen wasn't looking to refine a blood slave of semi-sage realm since there wouldn't be much difference in its strength with respect to Yi Zaiwen's. Moreover, he didn't wish to produce many blood slaves either. In fact, blood slaves of legendary level were out of question since he himself could kill many experts of that level. However, a blood slave above semi-sage level was valuable to him. But even a semi-sage level blood slave was enough to bankrupt him. He only had about 30 million Spirit Dawn in his stock along with some rare treasures. And items weren't the kind one would wish to sell. So, Yi Shiwen naturally didn't wish to sell them. He had plundered many Spirit Dawn from the body of Fan Ming and other disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for him to save up so many Spirit Dawn, especially when considering his quick consumption rate. You can do this. You'll need to consume a lot of Spirit Dawn, but it is advantageous to have it. You can continue to strengthen it. You can advance it to Sage Realm as long as you have enough Spirit Dawn. Even further until you've sucked this star colossus dry. Guillermo grinned and said. Its lips turned dark red. He had once followed the Devil King for countless years. What kind of cruel and bloody methods had it not seen? Human beings could be considered at the top when it came to displaying sinister and cunning attitude. However, when it comes to cruelty and brutality, the devil race was ahead of any other race. You could let him wail himself to death. Yi Shiwen looked towards the star colossus. He didn't say anything other than this. I'll leave everything in your hands. Yi Shiwen was only focusing on the end result. A blood slave of semi-sage realm would be of great help to him. However, it was important for him to find a way to earn Spirit Dawn. Presently, he needed to fill the gap of 20 million Spirit Dawn. Semi-sage realm meant that one had taken a half step into the sage realm. However, it had the word sage attached to it. Yi Shiwen could quickly enter the sage realm if he had a star colossus of semi-sage realm by his side. He could go to many places and have lots of adventures if he had one by his side. He wouldn't have to remain confined to a limited number of safer places. Yi Shiwen emerged from the space inside the heavenly source mirror. The hidden star peak was deserted at this time. The master and big brother weren't present. The second sister was undergoing a closed-door training. The third brother had gone to look for the big brother and the master. The fourth brother Yang Wenjun and the fifth sister Deng Shui Xen weren't present at the peak either. The hidden star peak didn't have many people to begin with. Therefore, it felt as if everyone had fled while taking a walk on this peak. Not far from there, the wolf cub was scurrying behind a spirit beast on another peak. The wolf cub's strength was far higher than that spirit beast's. The wolf cub was doing this just to enjoy the adventure of the chase, nothing more. He was a good-for-nothing freeloader. Yi Shiwen looked at the incomparably spacious and isolated hidden star peak. He couldn't help but sigh. The road to the revival of the hidden star peak was long and seemingly endless. It was very far away from its revival. Suddenly, a streamer of light flashed in the distance. The shadow of a person fell onto the peak. He was a disciple of the complete truth level. He could be regarded as a genius in the outside world. However, he was merely a trivial disciple here. Greetings, Brother Yi. That disciple promptly cupped his hands in greeting as he saw Yi Shiwen. He was older than Yi Shiwen, but strength was everything in this world. Supreme strength could gain respect from everyone, irrespective of their age. What happened? Yi Shiwen asked as he noticed the look of anxiety on the youth's face. Very few people used to visit the hidden star peak. Its own disciples were handful in number. It had declined long ago, so not many people arrived here nowadays. In fact, it was normal to not see anyone on this peak for an entire day. Brother Yi, I'm a merchant from the hidden star city, that disciple introduced himself. The true Martial University's campus was nearly as big as a large country's. Several disciples even held jobs inside the university. There were merchants, farmers, etc. Obviously, the nature of their jobs was entirely different. These farmer disciples were different from ordinary farmers. They used to plant various kinds of spiritual fruits. The merchant disciples traded divine materials and the most precious rare treasures. And the nature of their trade was also different. The true Martial University was surrounded by a large city. In fact, the city was an agglomerate of many smaller ones. These cities belonged to various inheritances. Basically, every top 100 inheritance had a huge city of its own. And every city was privately owned by an inheritance. One mustn't underestimate them by taking them for ordinary cities. They were the most flourishing cities. The experts of Truth Realm or above used to trade items between themselves in these cities. This wasn't an ordinary thing. A humongous amount of tax was collected by these cities every year. In fact, each city was capable of collecting more tax than a small country since. Initially, the subordinate cities of the top 100 inheritances were only open for their own disciples. Each of these inheritances had nearly hundreds of thousands of people. Some even had up to 1 million disciples. They obviously didn't have space to rent to outsiders. However, the hidden star peak was different. It had a handful of disciples. No one had any dominance on this peak, apart from its 6 disciples. Moreover, none of them was good at managing things. Therefore, Hidden Star Peak had only one way to survive, and that was to rent the city's places to outsiders. Various kinds of booths and houses had been rented out. This wasn't an issue for other inheritances. They had several 100,000 disciples, with some having over 1 million. Hence, there would always be some people who were good at managing things or running businesses. Even if one were to count the everyday revenue for such an inheritance, the number would reach astronomical figures. However, the Hidden Star Peak's Hidden Star City didn't have an excellent internal management system. In fact, their taxation rate was about 1% of other cities' taxation rate. However, the annual collection was still over than 2 billion spirit dawn. So, one could imagine how terrifying its annual trade must have been. This was because the Hidden Star City had a low tax rate. Therefore, many small inheritances that didn't have an independent city had immersed themselves inside the Hidden Star City and flourished due to lesser trade taxation. This boosted the city's collections and made it livelier than other cities. Other cities might have some vacancies, but Hidden Star City was always overcrowded. In fact, it could be considered an extremely expensive land. These cities inside the true Marshall University were built to accommodate millions of disciples in its peak time. The current population residing in these cities was nothing in comparison. It had been many years since the university's decline, and it was rare to see these cities fully occupied. However, this Hidden Star City was an exception since the overall taxation rate was only 1% of other cities. Therefore, the tax rate could be said to be extremely low. This was impossible to happen in other cities. Hence, many disciples had migrated to the Hidden Star Peak, and this had given rise to an overcrowded situation. After all said and done, the city's overall revenue was ahead of several others despite the low tax rate. Other inheritances had millions of disciples. However, this peak only had a handful of disciples who'd inherit the Hidden Star Peak someday. It could be said that they'd die with happiness when the time came. Notes: understanding the concept behind the city's success would require some knowledge on the institution that was followed in ancient societies. Taxes were often fixed despite the volume of business one carried out. Meaning, a guy making 1 million would have to pay the same tax as guy making just 10. The chapter would make more sense on an economical level if one were to read it with this concept in mind. This isn't mentioned in the text though, just a bit of economic history. Chapter 367. Only the Heaven's Pride level experts were capable of obtaining expensive resources in any inheritance, while the majority of disciples could only obtain very limited resources. However, this wasn't a problem for the Hidden Star Peak. Its annual revenue was astronomical. But there were only a few disciples on whom it could spend this revenue. They basically had everything that they required in Hidden Star Peak storage. Moreover, the relationship between the fellow disciples was very friendly. They didn't fight or scheme against each other like the disciples of other inheritances. "Brother Yi, you must come quickly, see what's happening. Those people of War Dead Star Peak have gone too far this time." That disciple spoke with a trace of anger in his voice. Yi Shiwen scanned the information about the War Dead Star Peak stored in his mind. It was considered among the extremely tyrannical top 100 inheritances at one point. However, it had fewer people since the times had changed. There was a huge difference between its overall might and that of the top 100 inheritances at present. So, it had been thrown out of the top 100 inheritances list since it had been replaced by some other inheritance. However, War Dead Star Peak had been in the limelight since the last 1,000 years. It was an inheritance with a heritage that had been passed down for 10,000 years. Its rich heritage was slowly flourishing with the passage of time. And it was striving to enter the ranks of top 100 inheritances again. The reason was simple. The top 100 inheritances were the real foundation of the true Marshall University. Every peak's chief and every city's lord inside these top 100 inheritances had the power to decide all kinds of affairs of the true Marshall University. An inheritance in the top 100 inheritances list held 50% veto power in all matters. Even the university head was incapable of overruling their decision. This rule had persisted inside the true Martial University since countless years. Generally, the responsibility of every matter of the true Martial University lay upon the chiefs of top 10 great inheritances and the university head. In fact, they would only conduct a general meeting if they had come across a big matter. The war-dead Star Peak wouldn't dare to expect that it could enter the ranks of top 10 great inheritances. However, it had more than enough strength to snatch a place for itself in the top 100 inheritances. However, the top 100 inheritances only had 100 positions. One would have to eliminate the other inheritances in order to occupy a position among them. Consequently, the ambitious inheritances used to compete quite fiercely with the ones hanging towards the end of the top 100 inheritances. However, quite unfortunately, war-dead Star Peak was one of the top inheritances which held the strength to challenge the top 100 inheritances, whereas hidden Star Peak's case was opposite to it. It was hanging at the bottom of the top 100 inheritances. Hence, it was the target of several strong inheritances which aspired to gain position among the top 100 inheritances. The war-dead Star Peak especially wasn't very far from hidden Star Peak, and had been eyeing its position. Joining the list of the top 100 inheritances wouldn't just greatly increase their power to voice their opinion in the affairs of the true Martial University, it would also give them the power to monopolize a big city. The hidden Star City earned astronomical revenue. How wouldn't one be jealous of it? The disciples of war-dead Star Peak have blockaded the hidden Star City. They aren't allowing anyone to go inside or come outside. Anyone who tries gets attacked. That disciple added, they inflicted serious injuries to Brother Yang and Sister Deng. What? Anger flourished inside Yi Zaiwen's heart as soon as he heard this. The war-dead Star Peak had been continuously coveting hidden Star Peak in the recent years. However, this was the first time that they had gone this far. They had blockaded the city gate and had injured the disciples of the same sect. This matter particularly involved two inheritances. They must keep aside their prestige to deal with it. How can this be? The disciples of war-dead Star Peak said that their chief has rejected the qualifications of your hidden Star Peak to remain as one of the top 100 inheritances and has applied to be a replacement. They will take over the hidden Star City once they replace your inheritance. That disciple's complexion turned ugly as he replied. People like him would side with the hidden Star Peak in this case. No other city apart from the hidden Star City gave such favorable business conditions. In fact, it was become impossible for these people to obtain a front position store. This was because the frontal stores were in the possession of each peak's own experts. In fact, a Sage Realm or Great Sage Realm expert would usually be standing behind a storefront. They didn't have enough space for themselves. So how could they possibly rent it out to the outsiders? However, the situation was different in the hidden Star City since it only had a handful of disciples in total. Therefore, the city was openly accessible to the other people. Moreover, it had very little tax. Such ideal business conditions couldn't be found anywhere. These people coming from small sects and small family backgrounds would be swept out of the city if the war-dead Star Peak were to gain control of the city. Brother Yang and Sister Deng tried to argue with them. They were injured by those guys as a result. The disciple said, I was in disarray, and ran here to inform Brother Yi about this. Yi Shiwen heard that and suddenly became angry. He hadn't opened his mouth to reply when the foul-mouthed wolf cub arrived beside him. Yi Shiwen, let's go clean them up. Well, beat them in one fell swoop. We ought to teach those bastards a lesson. The wolf cub was overexcited at the prospect to stir up trouble. Yi Shiwen didn't hesitate either. He trod on the rainbow light with the wolf cub and rushed towards the hidden Star City. The entire hidden Star City was in a chaotic mess. Many legendary or truth-level experts had opened shops for their livelihood in the city. Some of these shops were owned by genuine powerhouses, but they had hired some legendary or truth-level experts to run these shops since they didn't wish to spend their personal time and energy on this matter. Hidden Star City had never come across such a situation since the day of its establishment. Its own people had been stopped outside the gate. Over 100 experts of the war-dead Star Peak had blockaded the gate. Even the weakest among them was an expert of the legendary 8th stage. Many experts were at legendary 9th stage, and a few were at Legendry's Great Complete Realm. This wasn't the strongest lineup. However, the Hidden Star City lacked a proper backup on their side. Hence, it had no means to deal with such powerful enemies. Yang Wenjun and Deng Shui Xian had been wounded. They were lying in a pool of blood. This place will belong to our war-dead Star Peak soon. You people will have to depart. You only have 5 days. Pack your stuff and get out of here. This place will be known as War-Dead Star City in the future. An expert of Legendry's Great Complete Realm shouted loudly. The sound wave soared like a dragon's roar and spread across the entire Hidden Star City. The experts of War-Dead Star Peak weren't afraid of the residents and merchants of this city because these people had come from small inheritances. They didn't have a strong backing. So, forcing them to leave was just a matter of a few words, nothing more. They didn't even bother to pay attention to Hidden Star Peak. In fact, it had declined and fallen from its status as one of the top 100 inheritances as far as most people were concerned. It was an insignificant inheritance that only had a few disciples. This wasn't a cause of concern for them. It didn't have much strength. However, the Hidden Star City still occupied the status of the most populous and affluent city. There was no way this wouldn't make people envious. However, these people wouldn't need to be envious anymore because this city would soon be ruled by War-Dead Star Peak. What? The War-Dead Star Peak will have the control over the Hidden Star City? How is this possible? The ownership of this city hasn't changed since the last 10,000 years. It cannot be changed. Yes. The Hidden Star Peak has a very few disciples, but it has a lot of wealth. How will it not make people jealous? Indeed. Not to mention that the chief of War-Dead Star Peak has applied to replace the Hidden Star Peak in order to become the new member of the top 100 inheritances. This has happened numerous times in the past. The Hidden Star Peak was once amongst the top 10 great inheritances, but it has declined. It will eventually be substituted. No outstanding disciple has joined Hidden Star Peak in the past several hundred years, besides the surprising entry of Yi Shiwen this year. Yang Wenjun and Deng Shui Xian are quite strong compared to us. However, they are far inferior when compared with those Heaven's Pride level experts. And both of these disciples are over 100 years old, but they still haven't entered the semi-sage realm. The Hidden Star Peak had been destroyed long ago. It doesn't have any outstanding disciples anymore. No wonder it has declined. There were many old disciples of several hundred years of age who considered it unworthy and hence expressed their disdainful views. These people think that it's too weak. Can't they open their eyes and see that Hidden Star Peak has been able to maintain its rank for so many years despite such a small number of people in it? There has to be something up their sleeves. Many people have jealously looked at the wealth of the Hidden Star City in the past as well. However, not many people have dared to launch an attack on it. The War-Dead Star Peak is so impatient that it dared to pick a fight. Haha, well, have a good show this time. War-Dead Star Peak is very strong. The Hidden Star Peak isn't easy to deal with either. This is going to be interesting. However, it will be better if the Hidden Star Peak retains the charge of the city. If the War-Dead Star Peak were to take the charge, where will we have our foothold? Everyone was discussing among themselves when they suddenly heard a sound. A massive rainbow light fell down swiftly from the horizon. It was accompanied by a loud shout, "Which son of a bitch dares to cause trouble for our Hidden Star Peak?" Then, an astonishing sword intention took form in the sky. It condensed into a 10,000 feet long double-edged sword and swept towards the group of War-Dead Star Peak disciples to chop them. The ice-cold killing intention was scary, and the terrifying sword intention left the people with an illusion of getting cleft into two halves. Bang! 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 Those experts of legendary 8th and 9th stages didn't have the strength to counter this terrifying power. They were sent flying in the sky. They spurted out mouthfuls of blood and went flying for more than a dozen kilometers. It was as if a baby was facing an adult. They had no strength to counter this power. Only 5 experts of Legendry's Great Complete Realm were able to resist this sword intention. They had collaborated to block the incoming sword attack. Suddenly, that astonishing rainbow light fell down. The rainbow light dispersed to reveal the figures of a man and a wolf. Many sharp-eyed people recognized that invincible figure. It's Yi Shiwen. His name and fame have spread throughout the university since he has joined Hidden Star Peak. Indeed, he really lives up to his reputation. He has tyrannical strength. That one sword attack defeated those experts of legendary 8th and 9th stage and sent them flying. They aren't people with low abilities. In fact, they are considered as strong disciples in the War Dead Star Peak. Excluding the core disciples, these disciples have enjoyed a good reputation. Are you Yi Shiwen? One of those 5 disciples of Legendary's Great Complete Realm stepped forward and asked. He was clad in a fire-colored robe. There was a frown on his face. Chapter 368. Get lost. Yi Shiwen didn't reply. His complexion turned ice-cold as he shouted coldly. That expert clad in the fire-colored robe felt embarrassed by this. His complexion turned ashen. He clenched his teeth and said, Yi Shiwen, who do you think you are? Do you really think you're a Heaven's Pride level expert? Get lost. Yi Shiwen coldly squeezed out these words from the gap between his teeth yet again. Yi Shiwen, you're going too far. Another expert stepped forward and shouted. They hadn't paid much attention towards Yi Shiwen from the beginning. According to the rumors, Yi Shiwen had the strength of half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm. However, these people also had considerable strength since they were at Legendary's Great Complete Realm. Moreover, they were 5 of them and Yi Shiwen was alone. He couldn't possibly do anything to them on his own. They would have already launched an attack on Yi Shiwen if they hadn't been dominated by his sword attack a moment ago. Get lost. Yi Shiwen repeated the same words again. He didn't say anything else. He had said those words very faintly. However, these people suddenly couldn't bear to see the look of contempt in his eyes. They weren't as good as those other Heaven's Pride level experts who received everyone's attention and were considered as treasure by the entire True Martial University. But they were still considered top-tier experts among the inner disciples. An enemy of Semi-Sage Realm or Sage Realm expert would have been a problem. However, their enemy wasn't even an expert of half-step Legendary's Great Complete Realm, and had still dared to pull such a stunt before them. The battle between Fan Ming and Sword Sage had dragged on for a long time. That had exhausted both of them. Yi Shiwen had merely taken advantage of that. This thought had deeply rooted itself inside everyone. The fact that Yi Shiwen had just defeated some experts of legendary 9th stage hadn't changed their perception of him. That was because there was a difference of heaven and earth between the experts of legendary 9th stage and Legendary's Great Complete Realm. Yi Shiwen, you think that you're outstanding because you've made a great name for yourself or something? You simply cannot imagine the difference between your Hidden Star Peak and our War Dead Star City. Soon, this Hidden Star City will be a property of our Dead Star Peak. Therefore, it's in your best interest to leave right now. That expert stated in anger. However, Yi Shiwen didn't pay attention towards the sullen mannerism of these handful of disciples of War Dead Star Peak. Get lost. Yi Shiwen's words were as cold as before. His imposing aura had started to surge. Fuck you, Yi Shiwen. You refuse a toast, only to be forced to drink a forfeit. Today you shall die without a burial site. A Legendary's Great Complete Realm expert of the War Dead Star Peak shouted. His countenance had turned dark red. He brandished his long blade and launched an attack at Yi Shiwen. An incomparably terrifying and sharp blade attack cut through the vast sky and arrived in front of Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen, let's beat these guys up and crush them to pieces, the wolf cub shouted as he scurried beside him. Yi Shiwen sneered and stretched out his big hands. He didn't need anything else. His hands forged ahead to face the incoming attack. Bang! Yi Shiwen's hands grabbed the sword attack of that expert of Legendary's Great Complete Realm. The 2 terrifying attacks shook the sky as they collided. It seemed as if 2 raging waves had crashed against the shore. Humph! Yi Shiwen coldly snorted. His hands started to emit endless golden light. Suddenly, that long blade was ripped apart by the golden light. Then, an exceptionally terrifying power surged up as spiraling energies rushed forth. Puff! The arm of that expert of the legendary Great Complete Realm was turned into a group of blood fog. His bones were broken into fragments and were sent swirling in the air. Ah! That expert screamed due to the unbearable pain. His loud screams transformed into layers of sound waves and diffused in the surroundings. The surrounding space began to distort severely. Fortunately, the hidden Star City had a fine array of defensive barriers. Otherwise, it would have sustained considerable damage. Stop! An expert of the War Dead Star Peak was extremely shocked to see the manner in which his comrade had been thoroughly suppressed by just one move of Yi Zaiwen's. Hence, he promptly roared to stop Yi Shiwen. However, a lot of anger had accumulated inside Yi Zaiwen's heart. It couldn't possibly have reduced in such a short time. Yi Shiwen pretended as if hadn't heard anything. He released a golden light from his body and trod on the rainbow light until he arrived in front of that expert of Legendry's great complete realm. He then twisted his waist backward and shoved a kick into that expert's body. Bang! That expert was sent flying in the sky by his kick. The bones in his entire body had been broken by the kick. He went flying and crashed against a mountain peak several kilometers away. Bang! He collided against the mountain peak with a force so terrifying that it severed the structure. It was hard to tell whether that expert had survived the collision or not. Yi Zaiwen's one attack had deterred everyone. He had effortlessly defeated an expert of Legendry's great complete realm. Moreover, no one knew if the victim had survived or not. Yi Zaiwen's tyrannical strength had left everyone baffled. Humph, you guys are acting recklessly. Yi Shiwen sneered. His sword intention frantically condensed into a long sword. It rose against the wind and turned bigger and bigger in the sky. Eventually, it transformed into a very big sword and then rushed towards that young man clad in fire-colored robe to chop him. Bang! That young man promptly retaliated to block the incoming attack. However, how he could be Yi Zaiwen's opponent? That huge sword crushed the bones of his hands into fragments. His entire body pounded into the soil of the hidden Star City, just like an artillery shell. Only his head remained sticking out of the ground, and blood gushed out unceasingly from his mouth. Yi Shiwen grasped the startling great sword in his hand as he mercilessly looked towards those remaining 3 experts of Legendry's great complete realm. His gaze was ice-cold, unforgiving and full of killing intention. The opposite party had blocked Yang Wenjun and Deng Shui Xian at the gate of Hidden Star City and had then severely wounded them. Anger had flourished inside Yi Zaiwen's heart because of this matter. Yi Shiwen hadn't been a part of the Hidden Star Peak for long. However, he harbored an extraordinary sense of belonging towards this peak. The reason was simple. The fellow disciples on this peak got along well with each other and shared a harmonious relationship. They didn't fight and scheme against each other like the disciples of other inheritances did. Yi Shiwen liked this atmosphere very much. The Hidden Star Peak had a very few disciples. Therefore, they were very much united. Yi Shiwen, what are you doing? Do you wish to provoke our War Dead Star Peak and break out an all-out conflict between our inheritances? An expert of Legendry's great complete realm looked at Yi Zaiwen's cold eyes with a hint of fear in his own. He seemed afraid of looking into Yi Zaiwen's eyes. He had climbed up a stack of corpses and swam out of the sea of blood to get here. He was regarded as a genius. He was a well-known figure among the inner disciples. However, even someone like him didn't dare to look into Yi Zaiwen's eyes. The fighting strength that Yi Shiwen had displayed was too tyrannical. The rumor wasn't false. But the rumor about him picked up a cheap bargain because of the Sword Sage's bullshit. The disciples of the Sword Tomb who had witnessed the scene when Yi Shiwen had killed Fan Ming didn't dare to say that he had obtained any help from the Sword Sage. However, the other people had refused to believe it. Rather, they had chosen to believe in the ordinary explanation present in the other rumor to console their hearts. However, it had become clear that how ridiculous that rumor was. One simply couldn't say that Yi Shiwen would need any help considering his current strength. Suddenly, that expert recalled the first edition of the rumor. It wasn't Yi Shiwen who had obtained help from the Sword Sage. On the contrary, he had saved the Sword Sage. Get lost, you motherfuckers. Yi Zaiwen's slender arm lifted the great sword and brandished it towards that expert. Bang! Another expert was pounded into the ground by Yi Shiwen like a radish. One couldn't say whether he was alive or not. Yi Shiwen didn't care about the possible outbreak of a conflict between the two inheritances and bullshit like that. These people had arrived here and had blockaded the entrance gate, so they had it coming. Moreover, he had given them a prior warning, but they gave him no face and seemed prepared to fight it out. Therefore, it naturally didn't matter to him now. Yi Ziwen's sword would have slaughtered them all by now if there were no witnesses to this scene. I don't give a crap whether the two peaks have friendly relations or not. Get the hell out of here. Yi Ziwen's two loud sonic booms resounded as the two experts fell from the sky and plunged into the earth like two artillery shells. Their bones were shattered by Yi Ziwen's attack. He is extremely ferocious. He has effortlessly defeated 5 experts of Legendary's Great Complete Realm. Now nobody can say that he isn't a Heaven's Pride level expert. He has the fighting strength of Great Complete Realm. However, there was a huge gap between his fighting strength and theirs. This is a difference between top-notch talents and mediocre people. That's why they're called Heaven's Pride experts. Now I believe that Yi Shiwen must really killed Fan Ming with his own strength. That Fan Ming might have gone against the Heaven's will in the future if he hadn't been taken care of. Just you wait. I told you that we'd get to see a good show. The War Dead Star Peak has scaled enormous growth in these past years. However, the Hidden Star Peak cannot be taken lightly either. It seems that it has been gradually covering up its shortcomings. I still want the Hidden Star City to win. If it were to lose, then I'm afraid we'll have to leave this place. I've lived here for hundreds of years. I tell you, no place can be better than this city. Yi Shiwen turned around and descended next to Yang Wenjun and Deng Shuai-Xin. They were lying unconscious on the ground. Yang Wenjun had sustained more severe wounds among the two. Deng Shuai-Xin had been a bit fortunate in comparison. Yi Shiwen promptly took out some medicinal pills from the Heavenly Source Mirror and hastily fed them to his injured fellow disciples. The two of them began to breathe heavily soon enough, and eventually gained some respite. Damn it! You've done a good job. Now kill these bastards. Yang Wenjun opened his mouth and roared. His own roar affected the wounds on his body, and he grimaced in pain. I haven't been that badly injured by these people. Let Big Brother come back. Hell, pick up a fight with that War Dead Star Peak. How dare they bully Hidden Star Peak? Deng Shuai-Xin was quite intrepid as well. Yi Shiwen came to know everything from their mouth. The situation had been bad from the beginning. The opposite party wasn't ready to retreat, and was using every method to block them outside the city. But these two had remained extremely stubborn. However, the opposite party was stubborn as well. These two experts were unlikely to suffer the losses since they were experts of Legendary's Great Complete Realm. However, the opposite party had 5 experts of same realm. They combined and attacked Yang Wenjun and Deng Shuai-Xin, and defeated them severely. In fact, these two had come close to getting killed. Who is Yi Shiwen? A loud sonic boom-like shout sounded from afar. Chapter 369. Who is Yi Shiwen? A loud sonic boom sounded from afar. Yi Shiwen saw dozens of astonishing rainbow light coming towards him. Dozens of intrepid figures were treading on those rainbow lights. They were being led by an old man clad in black robe. His hair was crowned up like the head of a Siberian crane. There was a hint of a pleasantly surprised look spread across his face. It seemed as if he was unable to hide this look. Dozens of strong figures followed him on those terrifying rainbow lights. The emblem of Law Enforcement Hall was embroidered on the clothes of these people. Yi Shiwen frowned slightly. The wolf cub was beside him. He whispered to Yi Shiwen, "What are these people doing here? I'm certain that they're up to no good." Yi Shiwen flew up and stated, "I am." Yi Shiwen glanced at those people. Everyone's body was brimming with vitality. This indicated that they were ridiculously strong. In fact, the weakest among them was an expert of Legendary's Great Complete Realm. It was hard to estimate whether they were experts of Semi-Sage Realm since many of them had restrained their auras. That old man in the lead was undoubtedly a powerhouse of the Sage Realm. Yi Shiwen sneered inside his heart. Several strong disciples of the law enforcement hall had arrived at once. How could this be a good sign? Their ill intent could be sensed from such a powerful lineup of experts. Humph. Someone told me that you've brutally injured fellow disciples of the same sect. Therefore, I've came here to inspect. As I see, that's really the case. You'll have to come with us. That old man looked coldly towards Yi Shiwen as he spoke. A sinister smile had appeared on his face. How would Yi Shiwen not know what might happen to him if he were to go to the law enforcement hall with them? They had plenty of ways to forge evidences against Yi Shiwen and frame him. You sister fucker. Yi Shiwen secretly cursed in his heart. Who would believe that he rushed here after the incident had occurred? They would most likely be fooled by his external appearance. You say that I've injured fellow disciples of the same sect? Well, excuse me. I don't know what you're talking about. These people started it. They wanted to instigate disharmony between the Hidden Star Peak and the War Dead Star Peak. They can't be forgiven for this deed. Yi Shiwen said coldly. These people of the War Dead Star Peak had injured the disciples of the Hidden Star Peak. They had used the excuse of sending in an application to replace Hidden Star Peak in the top 100 inheritances. However, their actions couldn't be justified since a decision was yet to be made on that application. Yet they had still arrived here. It would have been fine if they hadn't done anything. However, they had caused this incident. So, the argument was on Yi Zaiwen's side. The opposite party had been too rampant. That was because they had underestimated the Hidden Star Peak. Though, that was justifiable since the Hidden Star Peak had a very few disciples. The Master and Big Brother would be perennially absent. The second sister cultivated like a mad person and would undertake closed-door training all year round. So, there was nothing to be afraid of. Yi Shiwen didn't have to be afraid of anything as long as heads stick to this logical argument. Anyway, he hadn't killed anyone. The Hidden Star Peak had declined, but an ordinary person couldn't take it lightly. Nonsense. You wish to argue? That old man shouted in a cold voice. He didn't wish to give Yi Shiwen any opportunity to defend himself. It is evident that you've injured the disciples of the same sect. Don't try to quibble. Then, the old man stretched out his hand. It condensed into a big hand made up of energy in the sky. It rose against the wind, and it got bigger and bigger in the sky. It was exceptionally terrifying. The tyrannical might of the Sage Realm firmly locked onto Yi Shiwen, and made it difficult for him to breathe. The experts of Sage Realm had surpassed the realm of mundane life to some extent. If an expert of Legendary Realm could be said to be a legend, then an expert of Sage Realm would be considered a myth. In short, Sage experts were people who had transcended the mortal world, and didn't associate with ordinary mortals. A sage expert was such a frightening existence in the 10 countries of the southeastern region that they could frighten any major influence and emerge as a deterrent force in the entire scope of the region. The experts of Sage Realm were considered as core disciples inside the true martial university. The core disciples had the same intelligence quotient as that of true disciples. However, they held a prominent position in the university. If the true disciples would be treated as the pillars in the hierarchy of disciples, then the core disciples would be treated as the foundation. The higher authorities didn't care too much about the outer and inner disciples. Their attention was mainly fixed on the core-level disciples. Yi Shiwen felt as if his entire body had been paralyzed. His muscles had become rigid. Indeed, it was the so-called massive suppression effect of the life control level. It had transcended the mortal world. The legendary realm consisted of legends, but it was merely a realm of mortal level and belonged to the mundane world. However, things changed in their entirety after one stepped into the Sage Realm, since they'd achieve an entirely different level called life control level. It seemed as if a sheep had bumped into a lion, such was the disparity created by the life control level. That big hand tightened its grip as it got closer. Yi Zaiwen's golden divinities began to surge up frantically. Roar! The divinities surged on Yi Zaiwen's body and rushed into the sky as he raised his hand. The divinities broke the strong grip of that Sage Realm expert and allowed Yi Shiwen to evade from getting shackled. Yi Shiwen had used his explosive power to break free from the shackles. He then opened his devil wings and dodged to avoid the incoming big hand. You dare to resist the arrest? The black-robed old man's complexion turned ashen. He hadn't thought that he would lose control over Yi Shiwen. He had estimated that he'd effortlessly seize Yi Shiwen. He felt that it would have been impossible for Yi Shiwen to dodge since he was extremely confident of his sage-level strength. He would be useless as an expert of Sage Realm if he couldn't even catch a trivial expert of half-step legendary 7th stage. However, unfortunately even he didn't know how Yi Shiwen had managed to break through his sage-level suppression. Grab him and bring to me. I can't believe that I couldn't bring him under my control. That old man ordered coldly. A terrifying chill spread out in the air. Several experts flashed into action like a puff of smoke after they heard that old man's words. They extended their big energy hands towards Yi Shiwen to capture him. You pigs! You have so much courage that you dare to lay your hands on my Hidden Star Peak's disciples. Suddenly, a loud shout exploded like a sonic boom. It had come from a distance. Then, a terrifying divine beam swept over from afar. Bang! 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 A loud sound of explosions reverberated. The divine beam trailed after those big energy hands and exploded them into pieces. Those big energy hands transformed into a mass of energy and dispersed in the air. Ah! 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 Those experts of the law enforcement hall screamed one after another. Their arms had been swept away by that divine beam and had been transformed into blood fog. Even the experts of Semi-Sage Realm couldn't evade the attack. In fact, that sage-level expert of Law Enforcement Hall was no exception. They held onto what remained of their arms as they continued to wail and scream. The black-robed old man covered his wound and shouted, "Who dares to attack the members of Law Enforcement Hall? Who wants to die? Humph, you have a lot of courage. How in the world did you gather the courage to dare cause trouble for the Hidden Star Peak?" A figure appeared in front of everyone after that loud shout resonated. He was a young man clad in black clothes. He was approximately 27 or 28 years old. He appeared tall and sturdy. His hair made it seem as if he had worn a jade crown. His eyebrows were slanting into his temples like two swords. He seemed to be brimming with a heroic spirit. Yi Shiwen didn't recognize this person. However, he knew the man who stood behind this person. It was the third brother, by Jiansong. That person's identity was on the verge of coming out in open. It was the same person the third brother by Jiansong had mentioned earlier, the big brother, Huang Wuji. He was an outstanding genius. His reputation had shaken the entire True Martial University once. Are you Huang Wuji? That old man looked at Huang Wuji and asked. A trace of panic flashed in his eyes. Huang Wuji. This name had flourished for a long time. These new disciples might not know that his name had once shaken the True Martial University. However, the old man knew this because he had heard legends about Huang Wuji's extraordinary prowess, exceptional martial knowledge, and elegant demeanor. You law enforcement disciples are very courageous. You took the advantage of our absence, and you've tried to cause trouble for our Hidden Star Peak's disciples. Huang Wuji sneered and looked towards that old man. He said, 1,000 years have gone by, but you don't show any signs of growth. Shut your mouth. The old man clenched his teeth and said, Huang Wuji, do you wish to go against our law enforcement hall? Don't forget that we've been given the authority to enforce law by the university head. Don't give me that crap. Who allowed you to come here and arrest our people? Huang Wuji asked coldly. Our Lord has personally allowed us to take this action. That old man answered as he gritted his teeth. But did I allow it? Huang Wuji asked lightly. It was a simple sentence, yet it was domineering without exception. You've dared to come here and cause trouble. Not to mention, my sixth brother is innocent. He is not at fault here. It's your fault since you've failed to handle this situation. Huang Wuji stated indifferently. His eye emitted a fierce and bright sheen as he looked into the distance. He was talking to that black-robed old man, yet he was looking towards the remote sky. The principles of Tao were flashing upon his figure. That old man in black hadn't expected that Huang Wuji would ignore him in this manner. In fact, he had disregarded the entire existence of the Law Enforcement Hall. No one would ever dare to ignore Law Enforcement Hall in the entire True Martial University. But this man had. He might have seemed ordinary, but he held the power to destroy the world if he wanted to. Huang Wuji, do you think that your hidden star peak is still in its peak time? How dare you act so rampantly? That old man asked as he clenched his steel-like teeth. You think that hidden star peak has declined, and so anyone can step on it? Huang Wuji sneered and squeezed out these words from the gap between his teeth. Get out of here. I don't want to kill you right now. Damn, this guy is even more rampant than me. Wolf Cub laughed and mumbled. He was usually an extremely insolent character and a full-blown attention seeker. Most people couldn't tolerate him. However, he had just seen someone who was even more arrogant than him. He felt as if he had met his natural enemy. Yi Shiwen looked at the tyrannical figure of this big brother. He couldn't help but admire the man in his heart. The big brother had given no face to the law enforcement hall. He was certainly more rampant than Yi Shiwen. Humph, Huang Wuji, your hidden star peak will face a great catastrophe very soon, the old man clenched his teeth and said. However, he didn't dare to argue with him any further. Huang Wuji's cultivation was countless times more profound than his own. In fact, it would have been difficult for him to determine whether Huang Wuji was a martial art expert or not if he hadn't seen Huang Wuji flying in the sky. The old man could only say ruthless words in response before he turned around and bitterly fled with that group of law enforcement disciples. Everyone ran away one after another. Their departure set off a wave of dust and whistling sounds. They are tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.